Hey guys, tonight we're heading north to talk about something cold, quiet, and surprisingly cozy. How the Vikings survived the coldest nights without dying. We'll take a slow walk through longhouses, layered clothes, fire rituals, and all the clever ways these ancient people kept warm through freezing winters. No battles, no shouting, just calm, candlelit stories to help you relax, get comfortable, and fall gently asleep. Life inside a Viking longhouse, asterisk, the door was barely a door at all, just a thick plank hung sideways on worn iron hinges, groaning as it opened. You had to bend low to enter, shoulder first. A gust of wind tried to follow you in, carrying sharp crystals of snow, but the woman behind you shoved it shut, sealing you back inside the dim, breathing dark. You were in a Viking longhouse, and it was winter. These houses were not majestic halls, like the ones carved into fantasy films or games. No golden beams or roaring torches. They were low, wide rectangles, built like buried ships, their backs pressed against the wind. The outside looked like a lumpy hillstone walls, stacked waist-high, with turf piled thick on top, stitched with roots and snow. But inside, it was the warmest place for miles, and the only thing between life and the long, frozen dark outside. It wasn't warm in the way we think of warmth. There was no glowing central fire and no chimney to let the smoke out. Instead, the warmth came from many small sources, all working together. The central hearth, the wool clothes, the packed bodies, the fur-lined beds, the seal oil lamps flickering near the rafters. If you stood too long in the middle, the smoke from the hearth stung your eyes. If you leaned too close to the walls, frost crept through the seams. There was no perfect spot, only a constant shifting between tolerable zones. At the center of the house lay the hearth, a rectangular pit lined with flat stones, filled with ash and flickering coals. It never truly went out. Someone, usually a child or elder too frail to fetch wood, would tend it constantly. They didn't burn logs in the way you might imagine. Greenland had few trees, so fuel came from driftwood, dried animal bones, peat, and sometimes dung. A good pile of peat bricks, stacked dry, could smolder for hours. The fire wasn't bright. It was a slow-breathing thing, a companion rather than a tool. Around the hearth, the house opened in a single long room. On either side were raised wooden platforms running along the walls. These were the benches by day and the beds by night. They were covered in straw, moss, or sometimes heather, anything to lift the body off the cold wood. Blankets, when available, were made from woven wool or stitched furs. Some were stiff from old sweat or damp from breath. Others were patched together over generations. The smell was thick, animal, sour, smoky. But to the Vikings, this was the smell of safety. Families didn't sleep alone. A typical longhouse might shelter a dozen people, grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, even travelers, if space allowed. Privacy was not a concept. Everyone knew everyone's coughs, habits, dreams. They slept side by side or head to toe, bundled in clothing, hands tucked into armpits, legs curled up like sleeping dogs. Some nights they would switch positions, just to get feeling back into a numb limb. Babies were swaddled in layers of wool and tucked between warm bodies. If one cried, all heard it. Along the walls were storage niches, hollowed spots between stones, lined with wood or leather. Here they kept precious things: combs, knives, cloth, dried fish, horns of sour milk, lumps of salt. Everything was stored carefully, sometimes hung high to avoid rats, sometimes buried beneath fur to avoid freezing. The air inside the house was always a little damp, always laced with ash, always filled with the quiet sounds of survival. By day, people moved around slowly. There wasn't much room. You had to duck under rafters or step over sleeping limbs. Tasks were done sitting on the bench beds or squatting by the hearth. Women spun wool, patched clothing, stirred pots. Men carved tools, sharpened blades, tied fishing nets, or repaired broken things. Children played with carved bone toys or chased each other until someone snapped at them. And all around them, the wind howled outside like a distant animal pacing. The house, even simple chores, became rituals. Sweeping the floor, more mud than wood, was a daily battle against tracked-in snow and animal dung. Melting snow for water took half the day. Making thin gruel from dried oats or fermented milk took planning. Every movement in the house was deliberate, with cold constantly at the edge of it all. And then there was the light. Light was precious. There were no windows, only small openings covered with translucent animal membranes or slats that let in pale rays when the sun appeared. Most of the light came from lamps, small, flat stones, hollowed out and filled with oil, with twisted moss or cloth wicks. These gave off a weak, flickering glow and thick smoke. Still, people placed them carefully on ledges, in corners, by the hearth-like stars in a low sky. At night, those lamps dimmed. The house went quiet. Only the sound of someone shifting in sleep, a distant cough, the groan of wind pressing. At the turf roof, it was a darkness you could feel, thick, muffling, slow. Many found comfort in it. Others whispered old sagas or short prayers to gods who might warm their dreams. The house became a living thing, breathing slowly through the night. But it wasn't all silence. Storytelling was one of the few joys that pierced the routine. After a meal, someone, usually the elder, might lean forward near the fire and begin a tale. It could be a saga of a great voyage, a battle, a ghost. Or it could be simpler, a story of a lost sheep, a stubborn goat, a neighbor who stole a turnip. The children listened, half asleep. The adults stared at the fire, saying little. These stories didn't just entertain, they passed time, eased fear, and reminded them of who they were. The longhouse also held animals sometimes. Chickens, goats, even calves were brought inside during the worst storms. They were penned at the far end of the hall, behind a low partition. Their heat added to the warmth, and their noises blended into the house's quiet rhythms. But they also added more mess, more smell, more danger of disease. Still, it was safer than letting them freeze outside. The walls and roof did not always keep out the cold. When storms hit hard, snow would creep through the thatch and settle in corners. Icicles might form along beams. Children sometimes woke with frost on their blankets. But as long as the hearth stayed lit, as long as the people huddled close, the longhouse endured. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't noble, but it worked. For months at a time, this single room was the whole world. Everything beyond it was ice, danger, and death. Inside, though just barely, they lived. But how did they protect themselves when they stepped outside that fragile warmth? What did they wear? And how did it really hold up against months of biting cold? The warmth of the Viking longhouse was relative. Inside, it was tolerable. Outside, it was a trial. And survival depended entirely on what you wore. Viking clothing wasn't designed for comfort or beauty during winter. It was armor, plain and simple. Armor not against swords or spears, but against cold that could gnaw at your fingers, bite your ears off, or kill you in your sleep. And they knew this. The moment a toe went numb, the risk began. The first layer was always wool. Vikings loved wool not for its softness, it was scratchy, especially by today's standards, but for how well it trapped heat even when damp. A long wool tunic served as a base, sometimes worn directly against the skin. Underneath, they might wear linen, though this was thinner and used more in warmer months. For serious cold, the outer wool was everything. Over the tunic came a wool cloak or coat, fastened at one shoulder with a brooch. These cloaks were heavy, thick, and sometimes doubly. And they weren't casually worn, they were draped carefully to cover as much body as possible. Some were hooded, others simply pulled high around the face. The edges might be fringed with fur if they were lucky, though fur was rarely wasted. On the poor, trousers were also wool-cut generously, singed at the waist and ankles to trap warm air. Sometimes 2 pairs were worn, layered for extra bulk. Underneath, if available, leg wrappings or long woolen socks protected the shins. And around the calves, you'd often see long strips of fabric tightly wrapped like bandages, leg bindings. These weren't fashionable, they were survival tools, keeping trousers in place and keeping cold air out. Feet were perhaps the hardest to protect. Viking shoes were simple leather, soft-soled, stitched from a single hide and tied with thongs. In summer, they were serviceable. In winter, they were barely enough, so people stuffed them. Dried grass, sheep's wool, even moss was pushed inside to insulate. Some people made boot-style shoes with higher sides and extra wrapping, but water seeped in easily. Once feet got wet, frostbite was dangerously close, so they walked carefully. They avoided deep snow, and they prayed the shoes would hold. Hands were wrapped too thick woolen mittens, sometimes sewn into the sleeves so they wouldn't get lost. Unlike gloves, which allow finger movement, mittens trap heat better by keeping fingers together. And when materials were scarce, people simply folded cloth over their hands and held it tight while working. The most vulnerable part was always the face. Scarves and cowls helped. Some wore fur caps pulled low. Others tied wool around their heads, leaving only the eyes exposed. In worst conditions, they smeared animal fat on cheeks to block the wind. It worked, but it stank. Even their hair and beards served a purpose. Frozen breath might crust a beard with ice, but it also slowed heat loss from the skin. Not all Vikings dressed equally. Wealth mattered. A well-off farmer or trader might afford imported wool, carefully woven and dyed with madder root or woad. Fur trim from fox, otter, or squirrel was common for the rich, but the poor wore what they had undyed, coarse, patched garments handed down and repaired across years, and still they survived. Sewing was a year-round task. Every household had needles made from bone or iron, thread spun from wool or flax, and scraps tucked away in baskets. A hole in a tunic wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. So women, and sometimes men, patched clothing constantly. They reinforced elbows, restitched seams, replaced worn laces. There was no luxury of fashion in winter, only function. Children, too, were bundled tightly. Smaller cloaks, tiny mittens, foot traps layered over foot traps. Babies were often swaddled in multiple layers, sometimes packed into cradle boards with moss as an absorbent diaper. The cradle boards were placed close to the fire, tilted upward, so smoke would rise gently over them, keeping insects away and helping the baby breathe warm air. Inside the longhouse, people didn't always remove these layers. If they did, it was usually just the outer cloak. But during the coldest months, many simply slept in their clothing, shifting and tightening it around them as needed. It wasn't unusual to wake up with clothing frozen stiff, especially if you'd sweated during the day. In that case, you'd hang it near the hearth and wait, sometimes for hours. Going outside required preparation. No one dashed out lightly. Whether to fetch water, check traps, or relieve oneself, you dressed carefully first. A belt helped hold tools or weapons if needed. A hood or hat was pulled down. The wind would sting your face immediately, and the snow might blind you if you weren't cautious. Footing was treacherous, and you never stayed out long unless absolutely necessary. So how did they dry clothes if they got soaked? That was tricky. Snow would often melt and refreeze on fabric, turning it stiff. The best chance was to hang things near the fire, but that space was limited and always needed for cooking or warmth, so people rotated items carefully. You might warm one sock while wearing the other, or hang your cloak over a sleeping body to use both warmth and proximity to dry it. It was slow, frustrating work. They learned to adapt. You didn't go out unless you had to. You didn't let anything get wet unless you had no choice. And you certainly didn't sleep without layers even under furs. Body heat was precious, and losing it meant a long night of shaking and shallow sleep. Interestingly, wool had another hidden power: fire resistance. Sparks from the hearth could leap out at any time. A tunic of linen might catch flame. Wool, by contrast, dies down. That made it not just a warm choice, but a safe one. You could lean near the hearth to warm your hands without fearing that your sleeve would ignite. Of course, the richer homes might have fur-lined cloaks, reindeer, bear, or even seal. These were warm, luxurious, and expensive. They shed water, better than wool, and insulated against wind. But furs were also heavy, and they reeked when wet. Not to mention, catching and preparing them was no easy feat, so they were prized and rare, passed down in families like heirlooms. When furs weren't available, clever substitutions emerged. Sheep wool was spun thicker. Layers were added. Cloaks were waxed or treated with animal grease to improve water resistance. Even fish skin was sometimes dried and sewn for protective coverings, especially in coastal settlements. It was stiff, scaly, and tough, but it held heat surprisingly well for sleeping. Many people wore a specific bed layer, usually a softer inner tunic, and socks, kept drier than daily wear. These were stored near the head of the bed platform, wrapped in cloth. Slipping into this set was often the best part of the day. It meant rest, it meant a break from chores, and it meant warmth that was personal and familiar. No one expected to be warm all the time. The goal wasn't comfort, it was preservation. You didn't dress to feel good. you dressed to not die, and the difference mattered. Over time, the clothing became part of the body. You forgot how many layers you wore. You only remembered when you took them off and felt the sharp breath of winter snake down your spine. Still, for all their preparations, there were limits. During blizzards, even the best-clad Vikings could be overcome. Tales tell of men found frozen just feet from their longhouse doors. Snow drifted around them, cloaks still wrapped tight. Sometimes, dressing properly still wasn't enough. Which raises another question. How did they eat well enough to keep warm? Because clothing alone couldn't fight the cold forever. The body needed fuel, hot, dense, strange fuel to stoke its inner fire. Even with wool layered over wool and fire burning in the hearth, warmth wasn't something the Vikings took for granted. They had to earn it day by day, bite by bite. Because inside every Viking body, the real battle wasn't just against frost on the skin, but against hunger in the belly. A body couldn't stay warm if it wasn't fed. That simple fact shaped the entire Viking approach to food during winter. When crops withered under snow and fish grew scarce in frozen bays, meals became a matter of survival, not satisfaction. But the Vikings were prepared. They were nothing if not stubborn and clever. The heart of the longhouse was the hearth. More than a fire, it was an anchor of life. Meals were made around it. Dried meats were hung above it. Stories were told beside it, and decisions were made by its flickering light. Fire was never left to go out, not in winter. Someone was always responsible for keeping it alive, even if it meant crawling from bed at night to feed it more wood. So what did they eat to keep that fire burning inside them? In truth, Viking winter meals were often bland, repetitive, and heavy, but that was the point. Calories kept you alive. The most common winter meal was a thick porridge, sometimes made from barley or oats. This porridge could be cooked in an iron cauldron, left to simmer gently over the hearth for hours. If there was milk, it was added. If there was honey, better still. But often, it was just grain, water, and salt if you had any salt left, preserved. Food was the lifeline. All through summer and fall, families had salted fish, dried meat, fermented vegetables, and smoked just about anything they could get their hands on. Herring was common. So were bits of lamb, goat, or wild game, salted and left to hang in the smoky rafters until winter arrived. The smoked meat wasn't tender, but it lasted. People would slice off tough pieces, soak them in water to rehydrate, then stew them slowly with whatever else was available. On good days, you might have carrots, parsnips, or onions left from a root cellar. On bad days, you might just stew the meat in water and eat it as. Fermented vegetables were less glamorous, but no less important. Cabbage, turnips, and leeks might be layered with salt and buried in ceramic pots to ferment, producing sour, tangy foods that could last all winter. The taste wasn't for everyone, but they added much-needed vitamins and cut through the monotony of grains and meat. Vikings also drank broth-rich, fatty liquid made from boiling bones. This was more than soup, it was fuel. They simmered animal bones for hours, even days, adding scraps of meat or herbs if available. The result was a gelatinous, savory drink packed with fat and minerals, perfect for staying warm on a freezing day. Butter and lard were treasured. Fat was necessary not just for flavor, but for energy. Spoons of animal fat might be stirred into porridge or broth to thicken it. Sometimes it was eaten directly. Butter, if stored in buried clay containers, could last well into winter. It was rarely wasted. Drinks were simple, usually water, ale, or mead. But water could freeze or be contaminated, so warm broth or weak beer was often safer. Still warm. Liquids of any kind were vital. They helped regulate body temperature and lifted spirits during long, dark weeks. And what of bread? Flatbreads, made from rye or barley flour, were common. They were cooked on stones beside the hearth or in iron pans. These weren't soft loaves, they were chewy, dense, and sometimes mixed with tree bark or ground seeds to stretch the flour. If there was yeast or sourdough starter, they might rise a little, but usually they were flat, round, and meant to be eaten quickly. Occasionally, when the weather allowed and stores were high, meals took on more flair. Feasts were rare in winter, but not impossible. If a successful hunt brought down a reindeer, or if a neighbor traded smoked fish for ale, the longhouse might prepare a larger meal. This might include multiple dishes spiced with dried herbs, or imported seasonings like cumin or coriander traded from far-off lands via coastal routes. But those were the good nights. Most meals were quiet, cautious, and practical. Food also shaped social rhythm. Eating was communal, platters and bowls shared, spoons passed around, bread broken by hand. In richer homes, there might be a carved wooden table. In smaller longhouses, meals were eaten right on the bed platforms, with food set in the center and shared by all. No one ate alone unless sick or shamed. Speaking of sickness, illness was more common in winter, and food was used as medicine. Broths were thickened for the weak. Honey was used to soothe throats or heal wounds. Herbal teas were brewed with yarrow, juniper, or angelica plants believed to fight infection or bad airs. There was no understanding of germs, of course, but centuries of trial and error gave the Vikings a kind of folk knowledge that kept them alive. And when even food ran low, the body turned inward. People entered a kind of semi-hibernation. They moved less, talked less, and slept more. Days shortened, the line between night and day blurred. Children were kept wrapped in cloaks. Elders sat closer to the hearth, bundled and dozing. Meals became thinner. The porridge got more water. The meat disappeared. And still they endured. For the very poor or unlucky, there were no preserves. These families foraged long into the snow-covered months. They dug through snow for buried roots, chipped ice from rivers, hunted rabbits, birds, or even scavenged carrion, if nothing else. Hunger sharpened instincts. A frozen berry might be a treasure, a stolen turnip, a gift. Some did not survive, but many did, and their tricks passed from mother to daughter, father to son, formed the quiet knowledge of Viking winter life. Interestingly, fasting sometimes helped. Not religious fasting, but strategic skipping of meals. The body learned to burn slower. 2 meals a day instead of 3, sometimes just 1, but it was sustainable. Even food storage itself was an art. Underground pits were dug and lined with straw. Clay pots were sealed with fat to keep air out. Smokehouses dried meat with care. Fish were packed in layers of salt and stacked in barrels. A single mistake rot, mold. A broken seal could ruin an entire supply. So each family became experts in keeping things sealed, dry, and safe from vermin. It's worth remembering that this wasn't survival for the sake of hardship. For Vikings, winter life was part of the cycle. Every spring was sweeter because of the hunger. Every thaw was a triumph, and they taught their children to do the same. The longhouse, crowded, smoky, filled with cold air and colder nights, wasn't just a building. It was a memory box, a place where stories kept the mind warm, where food kept the body alive, and where clothing became a second skin. Through layers of wool, spoonfuls of porridge, and the ever-burning hearth, the Vikings found a way not just to survive the coldest nights but to expect them. And yet, warmth from food and wool could only go so far. There were other kinds of heat, stranger, older, more sacred. Heat that came not from firewood, but from belief. In the next story, we'll explore what the Vikings believed kept their hearths burning, and the rituals they used to ensure it did. Clothing that doubled as armor against frost asterisk. You might imagine the Vikings as wild-haired warriors charging into snowstorms with nothing but courage and a battle axe, but if they did that, they'd freeze to death before the battle even began. The truth is far more practical and far more fascinating. Surviving the Arctic chill wasn't about brute strength. It was about layers, lots of them, and about knowing how to wrap the body like a fortress. Viking clothing wasn't fashion. It was defense. And each piece, from the itchy under tunic to the heavy cloak pinned with a brooch, served a deliberate purpose. To walk out into a blizzard meant calculating wind direction, moisture, and whether the snow would stick or slide. Getting dressed was like preparing for war against the cold. The first layer was always wool. Not the soft wool we know today, but thick, scratchy, coarsely spun wool, often made at home. Viking women were master spinners and weavers. It was their job to clothe the entire household, not just for looks, but for survival. Spinning wheels didn't exist yet, so wool was hand-spun with drop spindles, then woven tightly on upright looms that often took up space right inside the longhouse. You could be spinning thread right beside the hearth, listening to the wind shriek outside. Men typically wore a wool tunic as a base layer, long-sleeved, falling to the thighs or knees. Underneath, if they were lucky, they had linen shirts. But linen was harder to come by and less warm. Linen helped wick away sweat, but in deep winter, some skipped it entirely to focus on insulation. On their legs, men wore wool trousers, often tied at the waist and ankles to trap warmth. Underwear as we know it wasn't standard. They wore long woolen dresses or underdresses, sometimes layered 2 or 3 deep. Over this, kind of sleeveless overdress, secured with oval brooches on the shoulders. These brooches weren't just decoration, they anchored everything. From them dangled beads, keys, small knives, and sometimes personal charms. Feet were a problem. Shoes could ruin everything. Viking shoes were typically made from cowhide, stitched together in one piece and tied with leather cords. These were decent in dry weather, but in snow they were practically sponges. To combat this, many people stuffed them with straw, wool scraps, or even dried moss, natural insulation that could be replaced as it got wet. Some wore thick wool socks or wrapped their feet in cloth before stepping into the shoes. There was no right way, only the way that worked for truly cold conditions. Boots might be reinforced with extra hide or lined with fur. The wealthier you were, the more options you had: fur-trimmed shoes, sheepskin linings, or imported leather. But most people got by with cleverness and whatever animals they could catch or trade. Hands and heads were vulnerable. Mittens were common, knitted or stitched from wool, and shaped more like oven mitts than modern gloves. They were thick, thumbed, and often long enough to tuck into sleeves. Hats varied. Some were hoods made from layered wool, others were coifs that tied under the chin. A good hood could make the difference between frostbite and function. Even inside the longhouse, many kept their heads covered. Heat rises, after all. And then there were cloaks, the final layer, the armor. Viking cloaks were usually made from heavy wool and fastened at one shoulder with a brooch or pin. They were designed to allow freedom of movement on one arm while keeping the other bundled. This off-center style wasn't just tradition, it let warriors keep one arm free for tools, weapons, or carrying firewood. Cloaks might be lined with fur if you had access to it. Wolf, bear, reindeer, or even dog fur was prized. In coastal regions, sealskin was used. The more northern the community, the more fur was used as currency. Clothing was mended constantly. Nothing was thrown away unless it was truly beyond repair. A single cloak might be patched a dozen times, each stitch a reminder of past winters. Thread was precious. Needles were made from bone or bronze. Darning socks, reinforcing elbows, and restitching seams were part of daily life. Children learned to sew young not for fun, but because it was a matter of survival. Interestingly, Viking clothes often had layers of cultural meaning woven into them literally. Patterns weren't just decorative. Some believed that certain stitches or weaves offered protection, especially against spirits or bad weather. A tunic stitched by a grandmother might carry more than just warmth, it might carry memory, hope, or superstition. Even the brooches that fastened cloaks could be symbolic, shaped like animals, gods, or sun symbols. There was also social meaning in what you wore. The thickness, color, and decoration of your clothes showed your wealth and standing. Dyes were expensive and time-consuming to make. Deep blues and reds, made from imported plants or minerals, were rare and marked higher status. Most everyday Viking clothing was in shades of brown, gray, or dull green natural wool tones, or simple plant-based dyes. But even color served a purpose. Darker tones absorbed more heat in daylight. Lighter tones blended better into snow-covered landscapes for hunters. Nothing was random. Everything, every stitch, every fold was deliberate. And it wasn't just the people who needed warmth. Tools, weapons, and even food were sometimes wrapped in cloth or leather to prevent freezing. Axes left outside could crack, blades could snap, so even metal had to be dressed in winter. You might wonder, did they sweat in all that clothing? Yes, and that was dangerous. If you sweated too much while working, your inner layers could get wet, which meant rapid cooling when you stopped moving. So the Vikings had to learn balance, to strip layers while active, add them again while still, and always dry their gear by the fire before nightfall. They understood what we call thermal regulation without ever using the term. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothes, scaled-down cloaks, tunics, and trousers. But babies were often swaddled tightly in wool wraps, tucked against their mothers' bodies for warmth. Cradles were lined with fur or moss. No one left a child exposed. And elders fragile and slower to warm were kept bundled, often with their own bed layers. Even in the daytime, sleeping clothes weren't separate. You slept in what you wore, maybe, with a second cloak or blanket layered over you. Bedding was made from hay, feathers, or even old clothing stuffed into sacks. Beds were usually shared, husband and wife, siblings, or even parents and children huddled together. Body heat was a resource, not a boundary, so Viking winter clothes weren't about fashion at all. They were technology, layered, repaired, reused, and deeply practical, each piece built to keep the cold at bay without modern materials or electric heat. They turned wool, leather, and fur into a kind of armor, not against enemies, but against the silent, creeping danger of a winter night. Even with layers upon layers, clothes weren't enough by themselves. Something else had to fill the long, cold hours. Something that wasn't worn, but done. A ritual, a myth, a story whispered beside the fire. And that brings us to our next chapter, the fire rituals and forgotten hearth myths that helped the Vikings believe the cold could never win. You now understand the layers: wool spun thick, fur stitched tight, cloaks clasped with iron brooches. But Viking survival wasn't just about the fabric itself. It was also about how they wore it, when they adjusted it, and why even the smallest accessory mattered in their fight against the freeze. In this section, we dig deeper into the practically and surprisingly strategic choices that helped Norse people transform their wardrobes into weatherproof armor. Let's begin with the idea of body zones. Vikings knew their own bodies intimately, not from books, but from experience. They knew that heat escaped quickest from the head, the wrists, the ankles, and the core. So they built their clothing system around this understanding. Scarves weren't just for decorations. They were crucial for wrapping around the neck and mouth, trapping warmth with each breath. Some even wore them beneath the cloak, layered tightly like bandages around the throat. Waistbands were also critical. A simple woolen belt or cloth sash could trap heat at the center of the body. It pressed the tunic against the skin, reducing airflow and keeping warmth close. Some layered multiple belts, one for tools, another for sealing in heat. Even the placement of brooches mattered. A brooch on the left shoulder meant your cloak would wrap right over left, shielding the heart and core from wind. Travelers, especially messengers and traders, developed extra strategies. On long treks across snow-covered terrain, they sometimes carried extra cloth wrappings to bind around exposed areas. Reindeer skin mittens might be layered over wool ones. Feet were wrapped in strips of cloth, crisscrossed tightly like bandages, an ancient method still practiced in Arctic regions. Centuries later, and most crucially, these travelers learned to listen to the cold. Frostbite doesn't begin with pain, it starts with numbness. Vikings knew that once fingers went quiet, danger had begun. So they built rhythms into their routines. Swing your arms every hour, stamp your feet often, rub your ears, re-warm, recheck, re-wrap. The body was not to be trusted. It was to be managed. Special mention must be made of cloaks, particularly their dual use. By day, a cloak protected you from the elements, but at night, that same cloak became your blanket, your tent, your roof. If traveling without shelter, Vikings often wrapped themselves tightly and slept in shallow hollows dug into the snow. using their cloaks to seal in body heat. Furs were reserved for the coldest moments. Some believed that once you brought out the fur-lined cloak, it meant things had grown truly dire. In seafaring communities, sealskin played a different role. It was far more water-resistant than wool, making it invaluable for fishermen or winter boat journeys. Boots and cloaks made of sealskin were rare but prized. Waterproofing methods also developed over time. Animal fats rubbed into boots and outer garments created a temporary barrier against snowmelt. The practice was messy, smelly, and repeated often, but it made the difference between wet clothes and frostbite. It's worth remembering that winter wasn't a brief season in Scandinavia. In parts of Iceland and Norway, snow blanketed the ground from October to May. So the idea of winter clothes as something separate didn't exist. Every day, from hauling firewood to feeding livestock, was lived under the burden of survival gear. And within this long winter, certain rituals began to emerge, not just religious, but practical. One of these was the evening airing. Before bed, clothes were removed carefully, layered by layer, and hung by the hearth or over warm stones. Damp layers could kill. Wool that had trapped sweat during the day needed to be dried, or at least warmed, before the next morning. People would sleep in inner tunics or older cloaks, while the outer layers hung steaming above the fire. Children were taught to do this. From a young age, it was a chore, but it was also insurance. Another important practice was communal repair. In some villages, especially those isolated by snow, winter clothing maintenance became a shared activity. Needles were scarce and valuable, so repairs were done in groups by firelight, in shared longhouses, where knowledge was passed as stitches were sewn. A young boy might learn from his grandmother how to patch a torn cloak, or how to bind a foot trap for maximum warmth. The skills weren't optional. In winter, everyone sewed, everyone spun, and everyone prepared for the next cold snap. You might wonder, did they ever change clothes at all? Surprisingly, not often. Underlayers might be changed every few days or longer, depending on wealth and access to extra garments. But outer garments, cloaks, boots, and tunics, those were worn for weeks on end. Cleanliness came second to warmth. A wet sleeve or snow-caked boot was more urgent than a smelly tunic, and yet, despite the utilitarian nature of Viking winter dress, a sense of identity still persisted. Families developed weaving patterns that were passed down across generations. Simple geometric shapes, stripes, or herringbone designs were woven into tunics or hems, marking who made what and for whom. These patterns were not extravagant, but they were meaningful stitched lineage in wool and thread. There's also the case of mourning clothes. When someone died, their winter garments might be reused, but only after a ritual burning of certain items believed to carry the spirit of the deceased. In some regions, cloaks of the dead were cut and resewn into new items: gloves, patches, linings, so the warmth of one body might protect another. Even in absence, among warriors, winter gear was especially vital. Battles did happen in cold seasons, and while armor wasn't worn daily, it had to fit over winter garments when needed. That meant planning ahead. Chainmail over thick wool could restrict movement, so warriors trained in winter clothing, learning to move, swing, and fight while wrapped in layers. Even helmets were adjusted, some lined with fur or wool, to reduce the sting of cold iron on the skull. And then there were the sacred garments, the ones worn not for battle or chores, but for ceremony. In winter solstice gatherings, some Viking priests or community elders wore specially dyed robes or cloaks embroidered with sun symbols and fire motifs. These clothes had little insulation, but they were layered over practical garments, symbolism worn over survival. It was a quiet reminder. Winter could take much, but not their traditions. In the archaeological record, winter clothing doesn't survive well. Wool decays, leather crumbles, but we've found remnants, bronze pins, scraps of felted cloth, even child-sized mittens preserved in ice. Some graves have yielded partial cloaks, frayed belts, or fur linings still clinging to the interior of boots. These pieces tell a story not of warriors, but of survivors. Perhaps the most telling find was a single brooch, simple, undecorated, made of bone. It had been repaired 3 times, each with a slightly different technique. It likely passed through 3 hands, maybe a mother, then a daughter, then a granddaughter. Its value wasn't in its beauty, but in its continuity. It held cloaks shut against the wind, again and again. Quiet work. Forgotten history. Winter in the Viking Age wasn't endured by muscle alone. It was outlasted through planning, through sewing, through knowing how to layer and when to retreat to the fire. Every person, man, woman, child, was wrapped, not just in cloth, but in knowledge. And yet, even with the perfect layering and endless repairs, sometimes warmth had to come from something else entirely, something invisible, something older than clothing, something like fire. Which leads us to our next chapter, how ancient fire rituals and hearth myths shaped Viking winter life and why flames were more than just heat. By now, you've walked through the wool-lined sleeves, the bone brooches, the soot-blackened mittens, and the cold breath of early dawns. You've watched children wrap their feet in twisted cloth, elders red darn cuffs by firelight, and travelers brace themselves with seal oil and silent prayers. But none of this clothing, not even the warmest cloak stitched with ancestral care, could truly save a Viking from the depths of Scandinavian winter. Without one last piece, the fire. In this final section, we stitch together the last layer of Viking winter wear, not worn on the body, but carried in the bones. Tradition, ritual, and the quiet, shared knowledge of survival passed across generations. The outer layers may have been made of wool and fur, but it was the stories, habits, and warmth of the hearth. At the center of most longhouses stood the longfire, a rectangular pit carved into the floor, lined with stone or hardened clay. This was no decorative flame. It burned from morning until sleep, and often beyond. Children were taught to tend it as soon as they could walk. The hearth was used to cook, to heat, to smoke meat, to boil dye for cloth, and, most critically, to dry wet garments. Clothing was often stored overhead on hanging racks or beams. Above the fire, where smoke rose in steady curls, a cloak left too long became stiff with soot, but that was a small price to pay for dryness. This is where garments lived, when not on the body, where sleeves hung limp like sleepy arms, and wool tunics steamed gently above glowing coals. But the fire did more than warm fabric. It warmed belief. Norse culture was deeply spiritual, and flame was more than heat, it was presence. The hearth was often treated as a sacred space, with old embers from the previous year saved and kindled anew at solstice. Some families whispered to the fire, or left offerings near by food, bits of fat, or sprigs of dried herbs to ensure it burned strong. In Icelandic sagas, there are tales of women who could read the fire, interpreting the crackle, the color, the way smoke rose to predict events or misfortunes. Superstition, perhaps. But when you live with fire every day, it speaks to you in ways a cold outsider might never understand. Rituals connected clothing and flame to when a baby was born in winter. Their first wrap wasn't always a blanket hit, might be a piece of warm wool placed near the hearth for a night, believed to absorb the fire's blessing. The next morning, it would be wrapped around the infant, like a shield of warmth. Some called it hearthskin. When someone died, their winter garments were sometimes burned on the same fire that had once dried them. Smoke rose, carrying cloth and memory upward. In snowy months, cremation was often preferred. It was cleaner, quicker, and kinder to the ground. Snow made burial hard, but burning also held symbolism. Warmth returning to the gods. Fire reclaiming what frost had tried to take. The line between practical and sacred blurred often. Take, for example, the practice of ember cloth. On long journeys, Vikings carried tiny pouches of linen or wool padded with charcoal from the family hearth. These fire starters, kept wrapped and dry, could rekindle warmth far from home. But they were also symbolic, carrying your hearth with you, a mobile ember of memory. And in the coldest, darkest part of winter around Yule, the clothing itself took on festive form. Cloaks dyed in ochre, sleeves trimmed in wool tufts, hats knit in patterns unseen the rest of the year. These garments weren't warmer than others, but they were worn with a certain spirit. In times when the cold pressed hardest, people leaned into ritual not just to distract from the dark, but to reclaim color and pattern and identity from the monotony of survival. Some stories tell of silent contests, whose mittens were thickest, whose scarf longest, whose cloak most mended but still functional. It was a quiet pride, not shown through ornament but through endurance. A mother might smile faintly as her child put on the same tunic she'd worn at that aged hole, still warm. A grandfather might trace the lines of a repaired seam, telling stories about the winter that tore it, the fox that stole it, or the wind that nearly claimed him. Even among warriors, cold weather rituals were real. Before raids or hunts, some tied leather thongs around their arms or legs, not for strength, but for memory. A friend's belt, a fallen brother's wrist strap. Cloth became legacy. In freezing wind, it was something to grip, something to feel, something to remind you that warmth had a name, a face, a fire still burning far behind you. But clothing could not always win. There were winters when even the thickest layers failed, when the snow piled high enough to seal longhouse doors, when wool frosted over from breath and boots cracked in the dark. Those nights are barely mentioned in sagas, maybe because they were too common, or maybe because they were too hard. Yet even then, the response wasn't panic. It was patience, a quiet layering, a turning inward. You wrapped tighter. You moved slower. You whispered stories into the fabric to remind it and yourself to hold on. That's the real secret. Viking winter clothing wasn't magical. It was humble, clever, and endlessly maintained. It worked not because it defied the cold, but because it respected it. It didn't rely on heat alone, but on how the heat was kept through stitch and seam, through memory and ritual, through the fire that lived not just in the hearth, but in the habit of surviving. And now, as the fire burns low and the cloaks are hung for the night, the next question remains unanswered. How did the Vikings eat, drink, and cook through these bitter months, and what kinds of food, fuel, and strange preservation methods kept them alive long enough to see spring? How they cooked, ate, and stayed alive. The Viking world was not fueled by roaring hearths alone. Under the snow-covered eaves and wool-draped doorways, survival meant something quieter, eating just enough, stretching every grain, preserving every scrap. In this chapter, we'll begin our journey into one of the least glamorous but most essential aspects of Viking life: food. Specifically, how they kept eating through months when the earth was frozen solid and nothing green dared show its face. It began with planning, meticulous, repetitive, and rooted in ancient habit. The real work of winter survival didn't begin in December. It began in late summer and early autumn, when harvests were gathered and food preservation became a near-sacred ritual. Hay was cut, grains were threshed, and animals were slaughtered not in waste, but with solemn purpose. For each salted cut of meat, a future week of survival was silently marked. Grain, mostly barley and rye, formed the base of Viking sustenance. It wasn't eaten raw, of course, but ground into flour for flatbreads, porridges, and gruels. Winter bread was not soft or fluffy. It was dense, unleavened, and dark, baked in round slabs that could be eaten cold or toasted near a fire. Sometimes, these hard loaves were strung up and dried into near rock-like rounds, designed to last months. You didn't bite such bread, you soaked it. Meat preservation was an art form. Salt was valuable and sometimes scarce, but where available, it was rubbed into joints of pork, lamb, and fish to prevent decay. Drying was even more common. Meats were hung in smokehouses, sometimes in the rafters of longhouses themselves, where constant fire helped wick away moisture. The resulting cut, stewy, dark, and often pungent, were the staple protein of the cold months. Fish was even more reliable, especially in coastal settlements. Dried cod or stockfish could last for months. It was so hard, it had to be beaten with a blunt tool before cooking. In some areas, fish was stored in sealed barrels, packed with brine, or simply left outside in freezing temperatures, turning the landscape itself into a walk-in freezer. Fermented fish, including the infamous surströmming-style preparations, were not delicacies, they were necessities. They filled bellies when freshness was no longer possible. Then there were root vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots, pulled from the earth before the freeze. They were buried again in cellars or dug pits, kept cool but not frozen. Wrapped in straw or cloth, they could last well into the new year. Beans and peas, dried and stored in sacks, were boiled into thick, pasty stews. A single pot could feed a family for days. The longer it sat by the fire, the better it tasted. But what did a winter meal actually look like? Imagine waking on a frozen morning. The longhouse is dim, the fire from the night before smoldering low. Someone, likely a woman or elder, adds fuel, coaxes it back to life. From the side of the hearth, a pot is lifted. Inside, yesterday's stew, barley, beans, a bone or two, maybe a sliver of dried meat. It's thick, gray, slightly sour, Warmed again, it becomes breakfast. Later, if luck allows, flatbread is warmed. On stones, a smear of animal fat, if you have any, maybe cheese hour, crumbly, made in summer and kept wrapped in waxed cloth or birch bark. Milk is rare in winter. Animals are dry. Water, too, must be melted from snow or drawn from frozen wells. It's boiled before drinking, not for health, but to keep it from killing you with its coldness. There were often only 2 meals a day in the dead of winter. To preserve food, people spaced their hunger. Children were taught to endure. Instead of eating, some chewed dried herbs or knots of old bread to trick the mouth into satisfaction. Ale, brewed in autumn, was sometimes consumed instead of water, not just for taste, but because it stored better. In wealthier households, it was warm and sweetened with honey. In poorer homes, it was sour and thin. Dinner taken in the dark, by firelight, was the main event. More stew, more bread. If there was something special, like a smoked sausage, a leftover haunch of lamb, or a preserved fishet, would be shared in small, equal pieces. Elders first, children last. Not a matter of status, but custom. This is where ritual quietly entered the meal. Before eating, some families whispered short blessings, not grand prayers, but acknowledgments, to the ancestors who hunted, to the gods of hearth and field, to the invisible spirits that watched the longhouse walls. A dropped piece of food might be tossed into the fire as an offering, not wasteful, respectful. The flame must be fed too. Cooking methods were simple. Pots were clay or iron, suspended on tripods, or rested on stones beside the fire. Cooking was slow, and the same pot often served multiple purposes. Soup one day, dye the next, then stew again. Some homes used flat stones as baking surfaces, heated directly in the fire. Metal griddles were available, allowed more control, but mostly it was all done over open flame. You learned quickly, too far from the coals, it never cooked. Too close, and you burned your only meal. Food wasn't just about eating, it was about surviving boredom. The monotony of winter wore down the appetite almost as much as hunger, so even tiny variations mattered. One evening, the same barley gruel might be flavored with dried juniper berries. Another night, someone would add seaweed for salt. Ashes from special woods were sometimes stirred in, giving flavor and, perhaps, some trace minerals. None of this was extravagant, but it broke the sameness. Food storage also reflected ingenuity. In colder zones, pits were dug beneath the longhouse floor or just outside, insulated with moss, straw, and earth. Some communities even built communal ice pits, where larger items like whole animal carcasses were stored. Accessing these stores in winter required digging, sometimes through meters of snow. A misstep or delay could mean freezing fingers for a few strips of dried meat. And then there were the foods, not eaten, but remembered. Fresh berries, summer milk, roasted meat, with herbs. These became stories around the fire, spoken slowly, with eyes half closed. Memory as seasoning, taste as a form of hope. The hunger never fully left. Even in better households, rations grew thin by February. In hard winters, people tightened belts, stretched broths, and prayed the stores would last. Some chewed pine bark, some drank weak beer and skipped meals, and some did not make it. Yet somehow the system held. Through discipline, repetition, and shared sacrifice, Viking communities endured. Their diet might not have thrilled a modern palate, but it was efficient, predictable, and tuned to the rhythm of their world. And so, with the pot cleaned, the fire banked, and stomachs quieted just enough to sleep, we arrive at another question. How did the flame itself shape not just meals, but meaning? What myths burned alongside the cooking potsand? What role did fire truly play in a Viking winter soul? If food was the body of winter survival, fire was its soul. You've seen how the Vikings cooked with it patiently, with clay pots and smoked fish. But now we'll step even closer to the hearth, to look beyond boiling water and warm bread. This section is about what fire meant, not just as a heat source, but as a presence in ancient, flickering myth that lived in every longhouse and shaped the cold months in ways that went far beyond cooking. To the Vikings, fire was not a tool. It was a companion, a being, something watched and honored. Like the sea or the wind, it could save or destroy. It warmed meals, yes, but it also guided stories, cleansed sickness, kept away spirits, and shaped memory. There's a reason most Viking houses were built around it, not with the fire in a corner, but dead center, like the heart of a body. Each evening, families would sit around the hearth. The fire was low but alive, coals glowing red under a film of ash. Around this light, stories were told, not always epic sagas, but practical ones. The tale of the year, the stew pot cracked. The winter, the goat gave birth too early. The time Uncle Eirik boiled snow without filtering it and gave everyone stomach cramps. Fire made these memories possible, and it listened. In some regions, people believed speaking too loudly around the fire could offend it. So most talk was soft, measured, a hush that matched the snowy hush outside. Fire also served as a boundary. The inside of the longhouse was dark and smoky, but near the flame, things were clearer. Shadows danced on the walls. Faces took on warmth and life. Beyond it, near the door, was the unknown, a world of frost, spirits, and silence. The fire's glow wasn't just warmth, it was safety. And crossing that line, stepping outside at night meant leaving that safety behind. Younger children were taught to treat fire with caution, but also respect. They'd learn to read it, not just to tend it, but to know it. How to spot good wood from smoky kindling. How to stir coals without smothering them. How to tell if food would burn just by the sound of bubbling fat. The fire was both teacher and test. And in those lessons lived myth. There were stories of hearth spirits, sometimes called eldsalar, or fire souls, who lived within the flames. These weren't grand gods like Odin or Thor, but small, flickering spirits that kept watch. It was said that every longhouse had its own. They didn't speak, didn't ask for worship, but they were there. If the fire died unexpectedly in the night, it was seen as a warning. If a log crackled too loudly during a quiet moment, someone might nod and say, "It's listening." One Icelandic tale tells of a family that refused to share food with neighbors during a hard winter. That night, their hearth fire roared so violently that the beam above it caught fire, but the neighbor's house, poorer but generous, stayed warm and safe. A myth, yes, but myths carried warnings, and those warnings carried weight. There was also the belief that fire could carry words to the gods. Before midwinter feast, especially during Yule Blot, The winter sacrifice people burned small offerings in the hearth, a pinch of herbs, a sliver of fat, even a piece of worn clothing. These were tokens, messages, letting the gods know they were remembered. And in return, it was hoped warmth would remain in daily life. Fire shaped routine. It determined when people rose, when the coals glowed enough to stir, and when they slept, when the last log was placed. In some longhouses, the last person awake would whisper thanks to the fire before covering it in ash to bank the coals until morning. That ash kept the embers alive, quiet, hidden, but ready to wake, just like the people sleeping around it. Also guided health. Illness was common in winter coughs, fevers, aching limbs from too much cold. Without medicines, families turned to heat. Stones were warmed in the fire and wrapped in cloth, placed on aching joints. Herbal steams were brewed by placing bundles of dried plants in boiling water and breathing in the scented vapor. These weren't cures, but comforts, and comfort could mean survival. Some even believed that a fire could take on sickness. If someone was very ill, they might sit alone near the hearth while others left the room. The fire, it was said, would draw out the bad humors. Afterward, the room would be silent, the coals stirred gently, as if settling a deal between flesh and flame. And still, fire remained practical. There were dozens of daily rituals tied to it: heating pine resin to seal cracks in wood, warming needles before stitching thick cloth, using hot coals to light torches that would briefly illuminate the snowy paths outside. Every flame had a purpose, and yet fire was never fully tamed. It burned through roofs, it caught on cloaks, a child's carelessness, a sudden gust of wind, and a longhouse could vanish. Some regions banned cooking during strong winter winds for this reason. Better to eat cold than risk burning down your only shelter, because if the longhouse burned, all was lost: clothing, food, tools, livestock gone. That fear lived in the back of every Viking mind, especially in winter. There were no fire brigades, no second homes, just snow, just cold, just silence. So perhaps it's no surprise that fire also appeared in Viking death rites. Cremation was common, especially when the ground was too frozen to dig. The body, wrapped in cloth, was placed on a pyre. Special woods were chosen: birch for purity, juniper for scent. And when the flames rose, mourners stood silent, watching the same fire that had once warmed meals and dried boots now carry a life into smoke. It was full circle. Fire to begin the day, fire to end it. Fire to cook, to heal, to mourn, to remember. In the Viking world, you weren't just surviving with fire, you were surviving through it. And still another question burns at the edge of this flame. What happened when fire wasn't enough? When illness struck, hunger lingered, and one simple act, bathing, became a gamble with death itself. As we settle into the final part of this story, we move from the warmth of the fire into the chill of something far more dangerous: water. More specifically, winter water. In a world where staying dry often meant staying alive, bathing wasn't just inconvenient in Viking winters, it was borderline reckless. So why did they still do it? And how did they manage the delicate balance between cleanliness, superstition, and survival? To understand why winter bathing was such a risk, you first need to picture what it entailed. there were no indoor baths, no heated basins, no modern plumbing. For most Vikings, washing was done in streams, lakes, or snow that worked in spring or summer. But in winter, every drop of water was either frozen solid or cold enough to shock the breath from your lungs. A splash to the face could sting. A full plunge could kill. Yet hygiene was still a value to a point. Vikings were known, even respected, for being cleaner than many of their medieval European neighbors. They combed their hair and beards daily. They washed their faces with melted snow or warmed water when possible. They picked their teeth with carved bone tools and scraped under their fingernails. Cleanliness had a spiritual dimension too. It was thought that filth attracted illness, or worse, misfortune. But even that belief had its limits. In the coldest months, full bathing was rare. Instead, people practiced partial washing: hands, face, underarms, and feet, the parts most likely to cause discomfort or offend the senses. Warmed cloths were used, dipped into bowls of heated water pulled from the hearth. This water was rationed carefully. It took time and precious firewood to melt enough ice or snow to fill even one basin. Soaps did exist, but they were harsh, lye-based, and often made from ash and animal fat. Viking soap was more of a scrubber than a cleanser. It was mostly used for laundry and hair. Bathing with it in winter could dry out the skin, crack it, and lead to infection. Sometimes a quick rub with dry snow was used instead, brisk, painful, but oddly effective. Snow had the benefit of being everywhere and required no fuel to prepare. Still, some people did bathe, even in winter. Why? Rituals. Specific days on the calendar, like JL Yule or the start of a journey, were seen as spiritually important. Times to cleanse the body. Weddings, funerals, and sacrifices might require full immersion. In these cases, the act of bathing was done quickly and with helpers. Someone would stand by with warm cloaks. The bather would jump in, scrub quickly, and retreat before frostbite could catch up. There are stories, some true, some likely exaggerated, of men breaking through river ice, plunging in naked, and then rolling in snow as a show of endurance. These acts were often more about proving toughness or pleasing the gods than personal cleanliness. A man who could survive the cold of the river was believed to be strong enough to survive war, starvation, or grief. For the more cautious, steam was a substitute. Viking saunas, or sweat lodges, were small, stone-lined rooms where water was thrown on heated rocks to produce steam. People would sit inside until they sweated profusely, then scrubbed themselves with sticks or cloths. These steam baths were healthier, safer, and deeply communal. Families would sit together, sometimes naked, sometimes half-clothed, and talk softly while the steam wrapped around them like a second skin. Afterwards, they would cool down slowly, usually inside, not outside in the snow like modern ice bath enthusiasts. These sweat lodges weren't just about hygiene, they were about resetting the body, a way to fight back against the dampness and fatigue of a long winter. In some regions, the steam bath was followed by a ritual anointing with animal fat or herbal oils, preserving moisture, soothing cracked skin, and helping with circulation. But even this was a privilege. Not every household had the tools or space to maintain a sweat lodge. For most Vikings, the fire served double duty for food, warmth, and makeshift washing. A bowl of warm water and a scrap of linen had to suffice. Laundry was a different matter entirely. Washing clothes in winter was a dreaded chore. First, snow had to be melted. Then clothes were soaked, scrubbed with harsh lye soap, and pounded with wooden paddles or rolled with stones to agitate the dirt. Afterward, the garments had to be wrung out, a strength test on its own, and hung to dry. But in sub-zero weather, nothing dried. Instead, clothes froze solid, like stiff armor. Some people brought them inside and draped them over rafters or near the fire, rotating them as they softened. Others simply wore them stiff until body heat thawed them. Because of this, many Vikings wore the same clothes for weeks at a time. Undergarments were changed more frequently if they owned enough, but outerwear stayed put. Cloaks were brushed with dried moss or beaten with sticks to remove dirt and odors. Fur-lined garments were turned inside out and aired, but rarely washed. The idea was to preserve the materials, not scrub them to destruction. And, of course, the smell lingered. But winter dampened most odors. The freezing air dulled scent, and people became used to each other's musk. There was no concept of freshness as we know it. Instead, people smelled like what they lived with: smoke, wool, sweat, animal hide. These weren't offensive smells. They were honest ones. And yet, despite all the risks, there was something almost sacred about washing, even in winter. To pour warm water over cold skin, to scrape away the layers of smoke and grease, to feel, for a few minutes, like a clean, whole person again, even if your toes were numb and your cloak still smelled like fish. It was a brief moment of peace, a pause in the endless calculation of survival. There's an old Norse proverb that says, "A man should be washed and fed if he is to make sense." That's not just about being clean, it's about dignity. The idea that even in the coldest, most desperate months, people still sought to feel like people, not beasts, huddled in the dark. Because that, more than bread or broth or fire, was what kept Vikings alive in winter. The refusal to give up the routines that reminded them of life beyond the snow. The little acts of bathing, washing, storytelling, and sitting quietly by the fire. The belief that spring would come, that the ice would melt, that someday fresh water would flow again, and the stew would taste of herbs, not hunger, but before. That spring could arrive. There were still more long nights to endure, and more ways the Vikings outwitted the cold. So what about their clothing? What did they wear when the wind was sharp and fire could only do so much? Could fabric alone stand between a person and death by frost? Clothing that doubled as armor against frost. Let's imagine it. You wake in a Viking longhouse. It's still dark, because in the dead of winter, the sun doesn't rise until late morning. You can see your breath. The fire has died down to coals. There's a draft seeping through the turf walls. You sit up, muscles stiff, nose cold, and the first thought in your head isn't food, it's clothes. Because in winter, Viking clothing wasn't about fashion or status. It was a matter of survival. The right layers could mean the difference between frostbite and function, between waking up alive or not waking at all. When we picture Viking clothing, it's often fur-lined cloaks and iron helmets. But what they really wore during harsh winters was far more practical, layered, and frankly, itchy. The base layer was always wool. Wool wasn't just a popular material. It was a necessity. It retained warmth even when damp, and it was readily available from the sheep that grazed in warmer months. Men and women both wore long woolen tunics as a first defense against the cold, often belted at the waist to trap heat near the body. Over this, they layered heavier garments for men that might include a thicker overtunic or a sleeved wool coat, called a kirtil. For women, a wool apron dress, a sort of suspended overdress, provided both coverage and warmth. These garments were tightly woven, but still breathable. The goal wasn't to seal the body like a wetsuit. It was to insulate, to trap layers of air between fabrics, creating warmth pockets. Every stitch mattered. Underclothes were sometimes linen when available, but not always. Linen was more suited to summer. In deep winter, even underwear might be wool, scratchy, yes, but warmer than the alternative. Many poorer Vikings had only 1 or 2 full outfits, which meant wearing them constantly, even when sleeping. Now, shoes. Viking footwear was typically made from cowhide or goatskin. They were soft-soled, stitched with sinew, and often stuffed with straw or wool for insulation. On especially cold days, extra moss or scraps of fur were added. Vikings also wore thick wool socks or layered foot traps, strips of cloth bound around the feet to add padding and keep out moisture. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, unless you stepped in a stream. Then you had wet shoes for days. Unless you had a fire and a lot of patience. The outermost layer was usually a cloak or mantle. These cloaks were rectangular or semicircular, fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. They were heavy, often felted wool or sheepskin, and could be pulled over the head like a blanket. Some were reversible, wool on one side, fur on the other, depending on how much wind you needed to block. Cloaks were your portable shelter. You could sleep in one, ride in one, work in one. It was like carrying your own tent, and the older it got, the more reliable it felt. Vikings, who could afford it, sometimes lined their cloaks with fur, usually fox, hare, or squirrel. Bear fur was rare and valuable, as were wolf pelts. These weren't common, everyday items. More often, fur trim would be sewn into the cuffs or around the hood, protecting the most vulnerable areas, the wrists, neck, and face. Speaking of the face, Viking winters were brutal on exposed skin, so they used hoods, not just any hoods, but deeply cut ones, called skuldodaham hoods, close-fitting and long at the back to keep out wind. These hoods could be drawn tight or layered under cloaks, and in blizzards, scarves of woven wool or even strips of fur were wrapped around the lower face, just beneath the eyes. Imagine walking through a snowstorm with only a sliver of vision between your hood and scarf, just enough to keep going, to see the trail, to find shelter. Hands were protected too, though Viking mittens weren't dainty things. They were big, blunt, and made of thick wool, sometimes reinforced with leather. Gloves with fingers were less common, harder to make, and less warm. A good mitten trapped your fingers together like a furnace. Some even tied around the wrist to prevent snow from sneaking inside the sleeves. Now, here's where things got interesting. Viking clothing wasn't uniform. It changed based on region, material, and class. In colder regions, like northern Norway or Iceland, people wore multiple layers all day, even indoors. They sometimes used sealskin, waterproof and durable, especially for boots or cloaks. In coastal villages, Oiled fish skins might be layered into outerwear, giving it a strange but effective slickness that repelled snow and damp. Inland, where temperatures plummeted lower but snow was drier, people focused on insulation. They packed straw between layers of clothing for added warmth. Children wore sack-like tunics made from patched-together wool, less stylish, more survivable, and everyone recycled fabric. Nothing went to waste. A hole in a tunic didn't mean replacing it. It meant patching it, then wearing it over another patched tunic. In fact, many Viking winter outfits looked more like patchwork quilts than modern coats. There was one more trick: body heat. In larger families, people slept close together under shared blankets. In smaller longhouses, livestock might even be brought inside, not for company, but for warmth. A sheep or goat huddled near the hearth added body heat to the room. And in these spaces, people didn't strip off clothes at night. They just loosened belts, curled up, and slept in what they'd worn all day. Yet, despite all this layering, preparation, and insulation, sometimes it still wasn't enough. Fingers went numb, toes blackened, frost crept into boots. Vikings knew the signs of cold-related illness: sluggish speech, pale skin, confusion. They knew that cold didn't just bite, it took, so their clothing wasn't an afterthought. It was armor, a daily ritual of defense. And putting it on each morning meant saying, "I will survive today." But what happened when clothes failed? When the cold broke through all the layers, and only the oldest Viking wisdom remained? What ancient tricks did they turn to? Buried deep in their belief and myth, the fire rituals and superstitions that helped them survive the longest nights. When layers of wool, fur, and leather weren't enough, Vikings turned to something older, something that didn't hang in a chest or hang from a brooch. They turned to the fire and everything it symbolized. In winter, fire wasn't just warmth. It was memory, protection, and, in some strange way, a person, one that had to be fed, honored, and kept alive like any other member of the household. And so came the fire rituals, practices woven into daily life and long winter nights, rooted in habit, belief, and the quiet, patient magic of survival. The hearth sat at the heart of every Viking longhouse. It wasn't just a fireplace, it was the center of everything: cooking, conversation, drying clothes, rituals, and sometimes even sleep. The fire burned low and steady. A high flame wasted fuel. A slow red-orange bed of coals meant the longhouse could stay warm through the night without needing constant attention. People learned how to stack peat or wood to last until morning. Children learned how to rebuild a flame from fading embers. But there was more to it than technique. There were customs. Before a Viking woman stirred the fire in the morning, she might whisper a blessing over it. Before someone left the house for a long journey, they might touch the hearth and speak a protective word, not loudly, not ceremonially, but just loud enough for the fire to hear. The fire was not worshipped exactly, but it was respected, because without it, no amount of wool could keep the cold out. Some households practiced what we'd now call fire divination. They believed the way flames moved could signal the mood of the gods, the weather to come, or the fate of an absent relative. A crackling pop was sometimes heard as a spirit speaking. A flame that suddenly flared when no wind was present might be taken as a sign, good or bad. depending on what was being asked silently in that moment. But the most important fire-related ritual was the tending of the night coals. This wasn't dramatic, but it was sacred in its own way. Before sleeping, someone, often the eldest woman in the house, would bank the fire. That meant carefully arranging ashes over the glowing embers to smother the oxygen just enough to keep them hot but not burning. It was a balancing act. Too much ash and the fire would die. Too little and it might flare and burn through fuel meant for the morning. A failed fire meant waking to a frozen house. In some stories, it meant more than that. Folklore warned that letting the fire die could bring misfortune. A dead hearth meant an invitation to wandering spirits, to ill weather, or to the hunger of the land itself. So the last ember was always covered with care, as though tucking in a child. A hushed prayer or short rhyme might be murmured, sometimes just a few words about warmth, safety, or returning sunlight. There were deeper rituals too, saved for longer nights. In some regions, families made a small fire doll out of straw, a humanoid bundle no bigger than a hand, and placed it near the hearth. This wasn't an idol, but a symbol of warmth and endurance. During Yule, it might be burned, sent into the flames to mark the darkest day and encourage the sun's return. In this way, the fire was tied to the cycle of seasons, not just heat. Children were often told stories about fire spirits, not as terrifying beings, but as quiet watchers. If the fire burned steadily, it meant the household was behaving well, showing generosity, sharing food. If the flames flickered or sputtered, it was a sign someone had lied or hoarded something. It wasn't just superstition, it was a social tool. The fire became a mirror, gently keeping everyone in line. And just as the fire watched them, they watched the fire. They placed their damp clothes nearby, rotating them with practiced hands. They warmed their boots, careful not to let them scorch. They laid stones near the flame, which could be wrapped in wool and used as bed warmers under sleeping skins. Even food scraps had a place thrown into the flames with a whisper of thanks, not for the gods, not for luck, just because it felt. Respectful smoke was part of the ritual, too. Viking longhouses didn't have chimneys as we think of them. The smoke rose to the rafters and slowly filtered through the thatch or turf roof. It lingered. It curled around beams and seeped into the wool of tunics and cloaks. It preserved meat, hung overhead. It kept insects away, but it also burned the eyes. Living with a Viking fire meant squinting, coughing, blinking, and yet they stayed near it. Always there were beliefs about smoke, just as there were about flame. For example, when smoke drifted in a particular direction or hesitated near a person, it was thought to carry a message. A pause in the smoke could mean a death far away. A rising column that refused to bend meant clear skies. These signs were not always accurate, but they gave people something to read, like watching clouds or birds, something to focus on when the world outside was just cold, blank whiteness. And beyond the rituals inside, there were those kept outside, lighting a fire in the yard during certain festivals, like the start of Orablot. Thorablot helped bless the land and ward off evil spirits. The fire wasn't just for the people, it was for the animals, the tools, even the stones of the house itself. During these rare outdoor ceremonies, the flames were fed with food offerings, bits of meat, bread, or ale. not because they thought the fire was hungry, but because they were. And they hoped that by sharing warmth with the world would return the favor. Over time, some of these customs faded. Others remained, passed on quietly, barely noticed. A certain way of stacking wood, a particular place to sit near the hearth, a memory whispered during the first snowfall. And in those moments, you realize the fire was never just heat. It was a gathering place for the invisible fears, hopes, history, because when you think about it, clothing can only do so much. Wool wraps the body, but fire warms the soul. In the darkest nights of winter, the fire didn't just keep Vikings alive. It reminded them why they wanted to be. That warmth, that flicker of orange on the wall, that soft hiss of wood becoming light. It meant they were still here, still part of something, still waiting for the thaw. But survival wasn't just about heat. It was about knowing when not to tempt fate. And there was one thing Vikings learned quickly, never to do in deep winter, especially not alone, and especially not without a fire nearby, and that was to bathe. It may sound strange now, but to bathe in the dead of winter, for a Viking, could be an act of sheer recklessness. Not because they didn't value cleanliness, they did. And by medieval European standards, Vikings were considered notably hygienic. But in the darkest part of the year, when the winds hissed through the fjords and the earth felt sealed in ice, even the thought of undressing was a dangerous one. Warm clothing protected the body, but taking that armor off, even briefly, was tempting death. Most bathing in the Viking Age wasn't done for luxury or routine. It was practical, intentional, and in winter, highly limited. The average Norse person might bathe more regularly in the warmer seasons, often on Saturdays, which is where the Scandinavian word for Saturday, lagerdagur bath day, comes from. But come midwinter, even the thought of washing one's full body could fill a person with dread. Why? Because bathing required two things, water and warmth, both of which were scarce and treacherous in January. Streams and lakes froze. Wells iced over. Even snow had to be melted first, and that took fuel, precious, often hoarded wood or peat. To waste it on hot water for a bath was an indulgence most couldn't afford, so the Vikings improvised. They didn't go months without ever cleaning themselves, but instead adopted a kind of layered hygiene. Washing the face, hands, and feet, especially before meals or after handling animals, was normal. These could be done with small basins of warmed water, or sometimes cold water if fuel was tight. Snow was occasionally used to scrub, not because it worked well, but because it was everywhere. You could rub it on your skin like a crude exfoliant and brush off some dirt or sweat. It didn't leave you clean, but it left you changed, breathless, alert, and cold to your bones. For deeper cleaning, Vikings relied on steam, the closest thing to a winter bath. Communal bathhouses or sweat lodges, similar to modern-day saunas, were used when available. These were small structures made of timber or turf, sealed tight, with hot stones placed inside and water poured over them to create thick, rolling steam. Clothes were removed in these places. People sat on benches or low wooden platforms, letting the steam open their pores, sweat out grime, and soften hardened skin. Birch branches were sometimes used to lightly whip the body, not for pain, but for circulation and stimulation. It sounds intense, but it was controlled, and more importantly, contained. The danger came not from the steam itself, but the Step after cooling down. You see, the body reacts strangely when suddenly stripped of heat. A person who left a hot bathhouse and stepped into snow, even for a few seconds, risked shock. If they were wet, the moisture on their skin could freeze. Instantly, the blood vessels, which had just relaxed and widened in the heat, could suddenly constrict. Some people collapsed. Others simply caught infections, chest colds that turned into pneumonia, or frostbite that traveled quickly along fingers and toes. And then there was the risk of being caught outside, mid-bath, if something went wrong. A sudden wind, a drop in temperature, a fire going out. Imagine standing barefoot, damp, in a snow-covered yard with no flame to return to. For this reason, Vikings often delayed bathing altogether during the most bitter months, and when they had to wash, they did so as a family, taking turns inside a protected bathhouse, while others guarded the fire and furs. Because bathing was risky, cleanliness came in other forms. Hair was combed often, even in winter, to remove lice and debris. Beards were groomed. Vikings used small metal or bone combs, which they carried on their belts, like tools of honor. Ointments made from animal fat, mixed with herbs or ashes, were sometimes rubbed on skin to soothe dryness and block out wind. Animal tallow had a faint smell, but it created a barrier, not unlike modern lotion, that kept exposed skin from cracking or bleeding in the cold. Clothing played a role here too. A well-fitted tunic, worn for weeks, would absorb sweat and grime, but if layered correctly, kept most of it away from the skin. Undergarments, when owned, were occasionally swapped out or rinsed quickly and dried near the hearth. But again, this took planning. You couldn't simply wash a woolen shirt and hang it up. It might take 2 or 3 days to dry completely, and until then, it was dead weight. Still, the idea that Vikings were dirty or disheveled all winter is misleading. In fact, many outside observers from medieval Europe were surprised by Viking grooming habits, especially their use of tweezers, combs, and ear spoons, small tools for cleaning the ears. Viking men often braided their beards and kept them trimmed. Women braided their hair and used linen caps or woolen scarves to keep it from matting. Even in the cold, even in layers of patched wool and smoke-heavy cloaks, people took care of how they looked, not out of vanity, but out of order. There was dignity in survival, and personal grooming was part of that. So imagine this scene: a longhouse in February. The fire burns low. The wind howls against the door. A man sits bare-armed near the hearth, carefully scraping dirt from under his fingernails with a bone pick. A woman brushes her daughter's hair by lamplight, the comb dragging through tangles. Gently, slowly. Nearby, clothes hang on a rack to dry, stiff, steaming slightly. No one speaks loudly. Outside, snow falls in silence. The cold is still there, pressing against the walls like a beast. But inside, the people fight back, not with swords or shields, but with fur-lined tunics, soft brushes, sweat steam, and the careful decision not to strip down unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't laziness. It was knowledge passed down over generations. The fire keeps you alive, but your choices, your rhythms, your layers, your stillness keep you human. And as they drifted off to sleep, cloaked in smoke, wrapped in wool, layered against the night, they knew the truth. Surviving winter wasn't a single act. It was 100 small choices made daily, 1,000 stitches in a tunic, A whispered word over a hearth, a moment of stillness beside the fire, watching the snow pile higher and higher outside the walls. How they cooked, ate, and stayed alive when winter clamped its jaws around the land. The Vikings did not wait for mercy. They prepared, not in a frenzy, but in long, slow habits passed down like family heirlooms. Because eating in winter wasn't just about food. It was about having something left to eat when nothing grew and the fjords froze over. It was about what you could store, how long it would last, and whether it would kill you if it spoiled too early. Viking cooking in winter wasn't elegant, but it kept people alive, and sometimes just barely. Inside the longhouse, the fire wasn't just warmth and ritual. It was the kitchen. There were no ovens, no stoves, and rarely even proper tables. Meals were made over an open flame or in heavy pots suspended above embers. Flat stones were used like griddles. Some pots sat directly on coals, blackened with years of use, hissing softly as stew simmered or porridge thickened. There were no cookbooks, no measured recipes, just memory, habit, and hunger. Meat was a luxury, and even when it was available, it was rarely fresh. In the cold season, most of the meat was either dried, smoked, or salted. Dried lamb, smoked fish, and slabs of cured pork fat hung from beams above the hearth, turning slowly in the rising warmth. Preserved food filled the winter pantry, which was sometimes just a corner of the longhouse, or a shallow pit lined with straw and covered with turf. Fish, especially herring and cod, were essential. Coastal communities salted them in barrels or dried them on racks during warmer months. Once dried, the fish became as tough as leather and had to be soaked or beaten to soften before eating. The result was often chewy, bland, but nourishing, something that sat heavy in the stomach and made you feel, for a little while, like the hunger might not return. Grain, too, was sacred. Barley, rye, and oats were harvested in the fall and kept in sacks or wooden bins. These were ground into flour using small stone mills, a job often done by hand, turning and turning with aching arms. With the flour, they made porridge and flatbread. Bread wasn't fluffy or soft. It was dense, unleavened, and cooked on hot stones or inside ashes. It was fuel, not a treat. Vegetables didn't vanish in winter, but they changed. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were stored in cellars or buried in sand to keep them from freezing. Turnips and carrots were also hardy enough to survive if kept dry and cool. By January, these would be softening, losing flavor, but still edible. Stews made from these tired vegetables were common, watery, sometimes sour, but warm. Everything tasted better hot, and then there were the things that had no taste at all, but could keep you alive. Seaweed, moss, birch bark ground into flour to stretch a batch of bread. These weren't first choices. They were reminders. The line between hunger and starvation was thin, and when it came close, even the bitterest things became food. Vikings knew how to stretch their stores. One pot might feed a family for 2 days. The first night, it was stew, meat, root vegetables, a splash of buttermilk or whey. The second night, it was porridge, the pot refilled with water and more grain, absorbing what was left of the flavor from the day before. By the end, it was no longer meat stew, just memory soup, made of scraps and steam. Drinks were simpler still. Water came from melted snow or wells. It had to be warmed if the ground was frozen, and boiled if people were getting sick. But in truth, most preferred not to drink plain water. Fermented drinks like ale and mead were safer and more satisfying. Even weak ale, barely alcoholic, helped wash down stale bread or salted fish. Mead, made from honey, was rarer in winter but prized at gatherings. It was a celebration in a mug, something to remind you that spring existed. But perhaps the most important ingredient in Viking winter cooking was fat. Fat kept you warm. It gave energy when the sun disappeared. Animal fat from pigs, sheep, or fish was collected, rendered, and stored in clay pots or sheepskin bags. It was added to porridge, spread on bread, stirred into stew. In lean times, a spoonful of fat could be the most valuable thing on the table. Still, food wasn't just about survival. There were rules, rhythms, even rituals. Meals were eaten twice a day, one in the morning after waking, and one in the evening before sleep. Breakfast was simple: leftover porridge, flatbread, maybe a bit of cheese or dried meat. Dinner was the larger meal, though large often meant slightly less thin than usual. Everyone ate together, seated on benches or skins near the hearth. The head of the household, usually the eldest man or woman, distributed portions. Children were fed first in some families, last in others, depending on local customs. Sharing wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Hoarding food could bring shame, or worse, suspicion of sorcery. After all, if everyone's hungry and you're doing well, people start asking how. Guests were fed before anyone else. Even strangers. Hospitality was sacred. To turn away a hungry traveler was to risk angering the gods or the spirits of your own ancestors. This wasn't kindness, it was insurance. In the coldest winters, you might need a stranger's help. So a seat by the fire and a piece of dried fish were never refused, even if it meant thinner meals the next day. Cooking tools were simple: wooden spoons, iron knives, clay pots. Everything had to last. Repairs were common. A pot with a cracked rim was still a pot. A spoon worn to half its size was still precious. Some utensils were passed down generations, their edges darkened by hundreds of stews. Even in the darkest months, cooking never stopped. The fire was always burning, something always boiling, or warming, or drying. There were no exact recipes, no guarantees, just daily decisions: how much to use, what to save, who gets the last bowl. But there were feasts, too. Yule, especially, was the heart of winter celebration. Families slaughtered a pig if they could, a single animal that might feed 20. They baked special bread, brewed strong ale, and lit candles or oil lamps. The meal was more than food. It was a declaration: we are still here. In a season built on absence, no crops, no sun, no fresh green, a feast was presence made real. And after the feast came the leanest weeks. February was the cruelest month. By then, the stored meat was nearly gone, the vegetables limp or sprouting, the grain low. This was when skill mattered most: the careful hand, the clever cook, the discipline to eat less so the children could eat more. Through it all, the Vikings did not romanticize the cold. They did not pretend winter was beautiful or poetic. They respected it. And in their food, harsh, heavy, nourishing, they carved out life. Each bite was a small act of resistance. But food, no matter how warm, could only do so much when frost crept into the bones. What happened when even cooking fires weren't enough to chase away the chill? And how did stories, myths, and fireside tales become part of survival itself? Cooking kept the body warm, but stories kept the mind from freezing over. When the food was meager and the wind scraped against the longhouse walls like a dull blade, it wasn't always hunger that gnawed the hardest. It was boredom, hopelessness, and the long, dark deck. That's where storytelling crept in, often alongside the flicker of firelight and the smell of boiling broth. Food and myth in the Viking world were more connected than we might think. Sometimes you ate the stew. Sometimes the story was the stew. Long before Norse myths were written in sagas, they were spoken over embers. A simple turnip soup might accompany a tale about the gods tricking giants, or a fisherman's bad luck blamed on angering Njord, the sea god. If someone fell ill after eating spoiled meat, the family might whisper that a draugr, an undead spirit, had cursed the food. Tales gave meaning to random misfortunes. They also reminded everyone why certain customs existed, like never stirring stew counterclockwise, or why the youngest should never speak first at a meal. Even in lean times, people remembered to make offerings, a splash of milk into the fire, a slice of bread left on the hearthstone for house spirits. These weren't just superstition, they were ancient insurance. If the spirits were fed, maybe they'd keep the family fed too. Survival wasn't just about food in the pot, but also how it got there. Hunting in winter was rare, dangerous, exhausting, and often fruitless. Still, some men ventured out for ptarmigan, fox, or hare, following tracks through deep snow, armed with spears or bows. The meat was stringy, the skin barely useful. But in desperate times, a single bird could change a day. These trips were never taken lightly. A hunter lost in snow might never return, or return frozen, wordless, carrying nothing but frostbite. More common was ice fishing. Men cut holes in the frozen lakes with axes, using bone or wooden tools to fish. Some baited lines with bits of salted meat, others used woven traps. A catch of 3 small fish might mean an extra bowl of soup for the children. It was slow work, cold and silent, but it kept the longhouse from emptying too quickly. Back at home, women and children worked to stretch what little they had. Dried peas were crushed and added to thicken porridge. Soured milk was used in baking, and the whey, what remained after cheese making, was saved to cook vegetables. Every crust was repurposed. If a root was soft and moldy, the mold was scraped off and the rest boiled to death, just in case. The motto wasn't waste not, want not. It was simpler. Don't die yet. Salt was precious, often imported or harvested from seawater in coastal areas. Without it, preserving food became nearly impossible. Smoke was the other great preservative. Smoked fish or meat could last through the worst of February, though it tasted like firewood and chewed like old boots. Still, nothing went to waste. Even the ashes from the fire were used to clean pots, and bones, especially marrow-rich leg bones, were boiled repeatedly for broth until they crumbled. Oddly enough, winter was also a time when alcohol was more available. Brewing wasn't as dependent on the seasons as farming. Barley ale was the most common, and families often had small batches fermenting in clay jugs near the fire. Stronger drinks, especially mead, were shared during rituals or sacrifices. A single horn of sweet mead might be passed around during the darkest night of the year. Each sip a small reminder of community, of past summers, and of the gods' strange patience with mankind. Sometimes meals became ceremonies. Midwinter feasts were not just to celebrate surviving the first half of winter, but to influence the second half. The more generous the feast, even if it meant using up most of the stored food, the more favor one hoped to receive from unseen forces. They offered bread and meat to ancestral spirits, carved runes into candle stubs, and recited poems passed from grandmother to child. In this way, cooking wasn't just cooking. It was spell work. It was defiance. When the food did run out, as it sometimes did, Viking households didn't starve in silence. They borrowed, traded, or sought help from kin. Famine was a communal crisis. If one family suffered, others might pitch in, knowing they might need help themselves next year. But shame clung to the request. There were stories of men who wandered into the forest rather than ask for grain, and were later found frozen stiff under pine trees, clutching a stone knife or a sack of empty promises. Some, though, survived by sheer stubbornness. There were countless tiny tricks: soaking grain longer, drying seaweed by the hearth, fermenting cabbage into a sour mash that could last until spring. These weren't innovations as much as traditions, survival passed on like an heirloom, blade nicked and dulled, but still sharp enough to cut hunger. And through all of it, children watched. They saw their mothers slice the last root, their fathers return empty-handed from a hunt, their elders scoop broth for guests before feeding themselves. These lessons, unspoken, slow, and cold, shaped the Viking world more than swords or sagas. The next generation would know winter is not survived by strength alone, but by care, caution, and community. There was no heroism in eating dried fish and boiled bark, but there was dignity. The longhouse did not demand joy in these meals. It asked only for presence. One more morning, one more stew, one more story shared between bites of stale bread and silence. But even the warmest fire could not melt what winter did to the body. So how did the Vikings endure illness, injury, and disease when food was thin and medicine was rare? What happened when survival became a quiet, patient battle against their own bones? Even with enough food, even with warmth and community, the body still weakened in the long dark. The Viking winter was not just a battle against hunger, but against time itself. Cold months dragged on, and with them came illness, frailty, and the quiet creeping of exhaustion. Food could fill the belly, but it couldn't always fend off the infections hidden in smoky air or the fevers that struck suddenly, silently. There were no doctors. There were healers, and hope. Viking households had what they called a lickneer, a healer, often a woman, trained through experience and inheritance, not formal study. She knew how to steep birch bark into a bitter tea to lower fever, how to crush dried herbs into poultices for burns, how to use pine resin on infected cuts. She did not promise cures. She offered chances, and in winter, even small chances mattered. Injury was common. Fires were unpredictable. Hot stones cracked without warning. A slip on ice could dislocate a shoulder or break a wrist. And when that happened, the tools for healing were crude. Bones were set by hand. Cuts were stitched with animal sinew. A burn might be left to dry or wrapped in moss. Painkillers were rare. A strong ale or a deep sleep was the best one could hope for. Then came the winter illnesses, not exotic diseases, but common, slow killers. Coughs that worsened into lung fever, gut infections from spoiled broth or unclean water, swollen joints from sleeping too close to the cold floor. Malnutrition made every illness worse. A child without enough fat or iron from food could lose their strength in days. Some families watched helplessly as one child withered while the others held on. When sickness spread, some turned to prayers, not always to the gods, though Thor and Frey were invoked for strength and harvest, but often to house spirits, too. Ancestors buried beneath the floorboards, to the unseen things that whispered through smoke at night. They lit small fires, separate from the main hearth, placed bits of food near the threshold, burned herbs, not for healing, but for appeasement. If the sickness passed, the family whispered thanks. If it didn't, they buried the dead in silence. Burial in winter was another trial. The ground was too hard to dig deep. Often bodies were placed in shallow graves, under rocks or timber, marked with carved wooden posts that leaned as snow piled high. Some were cremated if wood was available, a precious and difficult choice in a season when fuel meant life. Death, when it came, did not feel like drama. It felt like a slow exhale, like the fire burning just a little lower. Yet, in the face of this, food took on more than just a practical role. It became part of mourning and memory. Families prepared a simple dish the deceased had loved, a favorite bread, a certain stew, and ate it quietly together. They might save a piece, wrap it in cloth, and place it near the grave. It was not wasteful. It was symbolic, a last meal shared across the boundary between life and death. And still, for the living, the days moved forward. Morning came gray, maybe, and someone stirred the pot, and someone fetched wood, and someone chewed a corner of old bread and decided not to die just yet. The importance of the communal pot, the shared bowl, cannot be overstated. It was rare for a Viking family to serve individual meals. Instead, one pot sat at the center, and wooden bowls were filled one by one. Children learned to wait, to watch, to know how much could be taken without leaving others hungry. This taught more than patience. It taught interdependence. Winter was not survived by strength alone, but by restraint and shared understanding. There was also ingenuity. Some Viking communities, especially those near the coasts or rivers, developed techniques that now feel surprisingly advanced. Fish, stored in ice-lined pits, root vegetables kept fresh by being layered in dried seaweed, fermented dairy products that kept for months, all learned through long repetition, through failure and adjustment. The Vikings were not just survivors. They were quiet scientists of the winter world. One overlooked fact is that laughter still existed, even in winter. Children played games by the fire with stones and bones. Adults told stories, not always myths, but funny ones. Old jokes, body tales, personal mishaps turned into entertainment. Laughter wasn't luxury, it was medicine. A few minutes of mirth could warm a colder night than any bowl of stew. As winter approached its slow end, sometime around late March, the food was at its lowest point, the barrels nearly empty, the bread nothing but crumbs, the cheese gone, hard and sour. But there was also a strange hope. Streams began to crack and move. Birds returned in flashes. Ice shrank in patches from the thatched roof, and so did the hunger, slowly, not because there was more food, not yet, but because the body understood that the wait was nearly over. Spring brought fresh watercress, the first eggs, even a rabbit or two. But by then the families had changed. A child grown quieter, a grandparent now missing, a new scar on someone's arm from a hearthburn that never fully healed. They had not just survived, they had endured a heavier, slower kind of survival, the kind history rarely records. But that makes all survival possible. When we think of the Vikings, it's easy to picture the raiders, the warriors, the sails against the sea. But those only tell half the story. The other half happened in the dark, in silence, inside smoky longhouses where meat boiled and babies coughed and women scraped mold from carrots. It was boring, it was hard, it was life, and it mattered. How far can comfort stretch before it breaks? In the next story, we step even closer to the fire, not just for warmth, but for meaning. Because, in the Viking world, fire wasn't just heat, it was spirit, story, and sacred force. What were the ancient rituals that kept the hearth burning when all else failed? Ancient fire rituals and hearth myths, asterisk, in a Viking longhouse. The fire was never just fire. It was breath, spirit, guardian, and grave. Long before matches and electric lamps, before warm pipes and modern insulation, there was only flame, flickering, stubborn, sacred, a small, controlled inferno in the middle of a cold world. It warmed the food and the fingers, but it also held something deeper, something ancient that no one dared fully explain. It was simply understood. You did not mock the fire at the center. Of every longhouse was the hearth, a long, shallow trench in the floor filled with stones and ash, its coals carefully tended day and night. The structure of the home itself was often built around the fire. Above it, a smoke hole let out the fumes. Though not always successfully, many Viking homes were dim and smoky, the air heavy with the scent of char and age. But no one complained. That smoke was proof that the fire was alive. And while the fire lived, so did they. Fire wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. In many Norse traditions, the hearth was believed to house a spirit, sometimes known as a vitor, a kind of domestic entity or presence. It wasn't necessarily a person or a god, but it was there, watching, warming, waiting. Families might nod toward the hearth before meals or toss small offerings, crumbs, dried herbs, or drops of ale into the flames as a silent thank you. This wasn't superstition in the modern sense. It was continuity, an old agreement between people and the fire. It was considered dangerous, even insulting, to let the hearth go cold during winter. A cold hearth meant more than hunger or discomfort. It meant something had been neglected, an obligation ignored. When someone died in the home, the fire was usually allowed to burn low, but never out. Sometimes, a log was set aside, specifically, to carry the spirit of the fire through the morning, as if to give it patience while the house grieved. Every morning, someone, often the eldest woman in the household, would stir the ashes and coax the embers back to life. It was a quiet ritual, done with care. She might hum an old tune, or mutter words from her grandmother's time, or say nothing at all, but her hands were deliberate. Stirring the ashes too hard could offend the fire. Dropping the kindling carelessly might cause the flames to sulk and resist. Fire, after all, was not a tool. It was a companion with moods of its own. Special days brought special rites. On solstices and midwinter festivals, extra wood was chosen. Birch for new beginnings, ash for endurance. These logs weren't just burned, they were blessed in small ways, marked with runes, carved with knots, or simply chosen from a sacred tree that had long watched over the land. The lighting of the evening fire was treated almost like a toast. It was the start of something, the flickering of life against the darkness outside. And then there were the stories, always by the fire, always after eating, when the warmth had returned to the limbs and the outside world was locked behind frost and wind. Stories of how the gods stole fire from the giants, of how Loki once tricked a hearth spirit into dancing on the roof, causing sparks to fall and wake a sleeping child, of how fire revealed the truth in a person, warm and generous for some, wild and greedy for others. In these tales, fire was not a background element, it was the main character. Fire was also used to cleanse when someone had been gravely ill or returned from battle or childbirth. Smoke was used to wash them, waving smoldering herbs like mugwort, juniper, or sweetgrass around their body, not to hide scent, but to drive away bad luck or spirits. Even tools and clothing might be passed through smoke. It wasn't medical sterilization in the modern sense, but it served a similar role: purification, renewal. It's easy now to forget how magical fire once was. Today, it comes with the click of a lighter or the flick of a switch. But for the Vikings, fire had to be earned. In rare moments when it went out during a storm, or if the coals failed overnight, it had to be reborn. Families would trade embers with neighbors, carry small burning coals wrapped in moss or bark, protect them with urgency. The idea of creating fire from scratch with flint and iron or bow drills was a last resort. It was like starting the soul of the house all over again. In fact, the act of relighting a fire carried a ritual weight of its own. Some believed you couldn't speak while doing it. Others insisted the first thing burned should be something sweet, a dried fruit, a bit of mead-soaked bread, to encourage gentleness from the new flame. Fire could be angry when awakened too abruptly. Of course, fire was also feared, not just because it could burn the house down, though that was always a threat, but because it could turn from friend to enemy with almost no warning. Many longhouses burned over the centuries, their dry timbers catching fast, their smoke holes choking shut. When this happened, it wasn't always seen as bad luck. Sometimes it was seen as judgment. Maybe the fire had been disrespected. Maybe the ancestors had spoken through flame. Children were taught early to respect fire, not just its heat, but its memory. Never throw trash into the flames. Never spit into it. Never point at it without purpose. And if the fire cracked suddenly, while you were speaking, it meant you'd just told a lie. These small beliefs weren't just folklore, they shaped behavior. They made the fire a kind of teacher, a silent elder that watched and listened. Even the ashes had value. Ash from sacred fires was sometimes sprinkled in fields to bless them, or mixed with soap to cleanse the body before important days. Some kept small pouches of hearth ash near their beds to ward off nightmares. The fire's work didn't end when it went out. Its remains still held power. It's worth pausing here. In this image, a Viking family gathered around the dim glow of fire, eating slowly, listening to a story for the 100th time. Outside, snow scrapes against the roof. Inside, smoke curls lazily upward. The fire flickers. It has seen everything: birth, death, laughter, betrayal, and still it burns, patient, familiar, holy. But what happened when the fire failed? What if the spirit was lost or taken? What strange rituals, protections, and punishments surrounded the loss of a hearth's flame in the darkest season? A Viking home without fire was not just cold, it was wounded. To lose the flame in the middle of winter was to feel suddenly exposed, not only to the elements, but to everything unknown and unseen. The flame was memory, luck, protection. Its absence cast more than just shadows on the wall. It left the soul of the house wide open. The reasons a fire might go out were many: a draft under the door, a snow-clogged roof, a child's careless hand stirring too deep into the ashes. Sometimes it simply died, tired, like anything else, but the effect was always the same: immediate tension. Conversation would stop. The oldest person in the room might lean forward, eyes narrowing. It was not shouted over or dismissed. The fire had gone out, and something had to be done. In such moments, the ritual of relighting became more than practical. It was urgent and ceremonial. The first question was always the same: whose fault was it? In households where belief in hearth spirits remained strong, the idea of blame wasn't just about carelessness. It was about disrespect. Had someone insulted the fire, failed to feed it properly, forgotten the offerings? Children were often the first to be questioned, not scolded, not yet, but watched carefully. If one had laughed too loudly near the fire or thrown something inappropriate into the flames, their misstep could be seen as the trigger. Not punishment, but rebalancing. A small apology might be made, a whispered word, a second attempt at the offering, a kiss to a piece of kindling before setting it alight. But if the fire refused to return, if the coals stayed cold, despite effort, the matter grew heavier. In some regions, families would not light a new fire on their own after a mysterious Instead, they would send someone, usually a young girl or an unmarried woman, to borrow fire from a neighbor. The ember was carried in a clay pot or hollow horn, wrapped in moss and careful hands. Silence was required during the walk. No matter the distance, receiving a borrowed fire was a moment of trust. The neighbor would bless the coal or whisper something into the smoke before handing it over. Once returned to the hearth, it wasn't simply dropped in. It was slowly introduced, like a guest, surrounded by dry bark, feathered straw, and patience. The women would sit and wait, barely breathing, until the first new flame bloomed. If it caught, a quiet sigh would pass around the room. If it didn't, things turned darker. Sometimes the conclusion was that the hearth spirit had left, or worse, been stolen. There were stories, mostly old and half-believed, of spirits wandering from home to home in winter, looking for warmer fires or more respectful hosts. A fire might go out one night and never truly return to full strength. These homes, it was said, had lost something vital. Food never tasted quite right. Dreams grew restless. Illness lingered longer. To prevent such things, Vikings practiced quiet protections. Salt sprinkled around the hearth, a ring of iron laid nearby, not in the flame, but near its base. A carved stone buried in the ash pile, marked with a simple rune for stay. These weren't dramatic spells or theatrical charms, just quiet gestures, like placing a hand gently on a friend's shoulder without words. Sometimes, though more drastic measures were taken. If a home suffered repeated flame failures or strange happenings around the fire, flickering when no wind blew, soot falling without reason, the conclusion might be drawn that the hearth had been cursed, either by a jealous neighbor, an angry ancestor, or a wronged spirit. The family would then seek out a local wise person, a Sikh or Simar, to perform cleansing rites. These weren't always elaborate. A bundle of herbs, lit and passed clockwise around the hearth. A short chant spoken in Old Norse. A sacrifice of food, often the most valuable morsel they had, placed directly into the flames. In some cases, a family member would sleep beside the hearth for 3 nights, listening for dreams or signs of return. In rare situations, the entire hearth was dismantled, the stones removed and reassembled, the ash shoveled out and scattered away from the home, usually into moving water. This was seen as dangerous, for it meant breaking a bond that had taken generations to build. But it also symbolized renewal, starting over. A house with a new heart. One might wonder, were these practices really spiritual? Or were they, perhaps, practical systems dressed in ritual? After all, sharing fire between homes ensured community bonding, seasonal cleansing, reduced smoke buildup, and pests. Stories about fire spirits taught children to behave safely. But in Viking society, there was little need to separate the practical from the sacred. A thing could be both. It's also worth noting that fire connected the living to the dead. Ashes from funeral pyres, when they could be afforded, were sometimes kept in small urns near the hearth, as if the flame of life and death should never stray too far apart. The hearth became a memory space, a quiet altar to those who had once sat beside the same warmth. Even food left for spirits was often burned. The smell of meat crackling, bread charring slightly at the edges. These were not just aromas of cooking, but of offering. The flame took what was given, and in taking it, returned nothing visible, only a strange reassurance that the exchange had happened, that someone or something had received it. This belief in exchange extended into daily habits. People said thank you to the fire. They apologized when it smoked. They offered comfort to it after loud arguments in the room. The fire had ears, after all, and feelings, but the greatest ritual of all came not from ceremony, but from routine, feeding the fire. Not once a day or only when cold, but regularly, thoughtfully. Even in the middle of the night, someone would stir from a shared bed pile and check the coals. Add a sliver of dry pine, whisper, return to sleep. The flame was never left alone too long. That was how trust was kept. And when the first light of spring crept in through the smoke hole and the days grew longer, the fire still burned. Not for survival now, but out of gratitude. A smaller flame, perhaps, but still alive, still humming with breath and memory. But how far did that memory go? In the deepest winters, were there fires that told stories, that remembered things. What legends were passed from one hearth to another, not in books, but in embers, songs, and silence. Not every fire in a Viking longhouse was just fire. Some were said to remember, not in the way humans do, with words and images, but through a kind of silent presence, a steady awareness, like a guardian that never blinked. Over years and decades, the flames that lit the same stones, touched the same soot-darkened beams, began to feel like old souls in themselves. They had seen births, deaths, quiet tears, rowdy laughter. The flicker of their light had fallen across hundreds of moments, ordinary and sacred. And because of this, many believed that the fire knew these memory fires, as they were sometimes called in whispered stories, weren't marked with signs or rituals. They simply were. They lived longest in homes where the hearth had never gone cold, or the flame had passed hand to hand through the generations. Always nurtured, never dismissed. These homes had a hush to them, a warmth that lingered just a little longer, even after the fire died down for the night. Elders told tales of fires that reacted to words, a pop when an ancestor's name was spoken, a sudden gust of heat when a promise was made. One story from eastern Scandinavia spoke of a hearth that flared blue when a thief entered the house, though no wind blew and no door opened. Another tale, told quietly by fishermen who had lost brothers to the sea, told of a fire that refused to light for 3 nights after a man had lied to his wife. The fire, it seemed, kept its own counsel. Were these stories just folklore? Possibly, but they were treated as truth. Fire itself was used to tell stories, not through flames directly, but through the act of sitting near it, letting the rhythms of heat and shadow shape the words. A father might tell a tale in the low voice of the flame, slow, with long pauses. A grandmother might mark each part of the story with a toss of herbs into the coals, sage for memory, mugwort for dreams, birch for beginnings. The smoke would swirl upward as the words floated out, giving each tale the weight of ritual. Some believed the fire responded with its own language. A loud crack meant approval, a sudden puff of smoke, warning, a stubborn refusal to catch, disagreement. Whether or not it was real didn't matter. It was understood. The fire had its moods. One treated it with respect, like an old teacher, patient, but never to be mocked. This respect carried over into the transitions of life. When a child was born, a small piece of the hearth's fire was placed near them on their first night to grant warmth and protection. When a young adult left the household, often to marry or settle land, they were sometimes given an ember wrapped in wool. This was their family's fire, a literal flame carried from one life to the next. Even more moving were the rituals of death. If a family member died within the home, the hearth was not extinguished. Instead, it was dimmed, left to smolder quietly as the house fell into mourning. Some families placed the deceased's favorite food or tool in the fire after burial, not to destroy it, but to carry it through the flame to the other side. The fire consumed, but it also connected in rare cases. A death caused the fire to act strangely, refusing to light or flaring violently when stoked. These moments were feared, but also honored. They were seen as signs that the fire had felt the passing, that it was grieving too, and just as fire marked beginnings and endings, it also marked forgiveness. In families where a rift had formed, a bitter argument, a broken trust, reconciliation sometimes began not with words, but with the fire. One person would offer to tend the hearth for the night, stir the coals, add the first log. It was a silent gesture that said, "Let this be warm again." If the fire caught easily, it was taken as a good omen, a sign that peace had begun. These quiet rituals formed a language no longer spoken, one of gesture, habit, and the long patience of flame. A father passing his fire-tending stone to his daughter. A son folding the old ashes into his wedding hearth. These weren't grand ceremonies, just slow, thoughtful acts that kept the past alive. Interestingly, not all hearths burned wood. In places where wood was scarce, such as Iceland, peat was used instead. These bricks of dried, compacted vegetation burned more slowly and produced thick, earthy smoke. They didn't crackle the way wood did, and so the stories had to adjust. In these homes, it was the smell of the peat that carried memory, the slow rise of warmth, the feel of it in the bones. Fire didn't have to speak loudly to be heard. In later centuries, when Christianity spread across Norse lands, many of these beliefs faded or blended. The hearth became a place to say grace. The spirits became angels or saints. But even then, the memory of the old fire lingered. Candles were lit in similar patterns. Ashes were still respected. The silence by the fire remained holy. It's easy today to overlook this, to see fire as a utility, something that clicks on when we press a button. But in Viking life, it was never just flame. It was heritage. It was a conversation between generations, a warmth that held more than just heat. When a fire burned well, it was said to speak gently. Its light wrapped around you like an old song, its glow steady and calm. To fall asleep by it was to trust that you were being watched over, not by gods or ghosts, but by something older, something that had always been there. And when you stirred in the night, hearing wind against the walls, you might lift your head and look to the hearth, still burning, still waiting, still remembering. Was this fire just flame? Or was it, perhaps, the most ancient of storytellers, one that never spoke aloud, but knew the oldest tales of all? And why bathing in winter was basically a death wish asterisk in the modern world. Bathing is a matter of comfort, hygiene, and habit. Showers are hot, steam rises pleasantly, and the idea of skipping a day, let alone a week, feels unpleasant, even taboo. But in the icy winters of the Viking Age, washing oneself was not a daily luxury. In fact, it was a decision weighted with danger. During the coldest months, bathing could kill you. It wasn't because the Vikings didn't understand the value of cleanliness. On the contrary, historical sources from other European travelers often commented, sometimes with grudging admiration, on how well-groomed the Norsemen seemed. Combs, tweezers, and ear spoons were common artifacts found in Viking graves. Vikings bathed at least weekly, usually on Laugardagor washing day, which gave us the modern word Saturday. They braided hair, trimmed beards, and took pride in their appearance. But this hygiene had its seasonal limits. Once winter settled across the land, really settled, bathing became something you didn't do lightly. With temperatures falling well below freezing, water had to be melted by fire, which required a lot of fuel, a resource better used for heating the home or cooking food. And even if one had the firewood to spare, the act of undressing in a freezing longhouse, scrubbing exposed skin, and stepping out of the warmth for even a few minutes could be lethal. Unlike today's well-insulated rooms and closed plumbing, Viking bathing involved large wooden tubs, hot stones, or visits to sweat lodges, much like primitive saunas. In some regions, these bathing houses were dug partially into the ground and heated with fires or steam. You'd strip down, sweat it out, and then, ideally, rinse with water or even snow. But therein lay the problem. It required full exposure. A Viking could go into the sweat house, warm and relaxed, only to emerge into biting wind with pores wide open and limbs damp. In those conditions, even a few minutes of exposure could invite chills that grew into fever. Respiratory infections, known then only by their symptoms, coughing, rattling breath, weakness, often followed, with no antibiotics and few treatments. Beyond herbal teas and hope, a simple cold could become a death sentence. This wasn't superstition. It was hard-won knowledge. People learned through bitter experience. A man would wash after working in the stables, then grow ill by nightfall. A woman might bathe before a feast, only to spend the next week shivering in bed, her skin burning with a heat no hearth could ease. Children, especially, were watched closely. Clean hair wasn't worth the risk of a fevered night. Because of this, alternative methods of staying clean emerged. Dry washing using cloth and snow was more common. People rubbed themselves down with snow not to chill, but to remove sweat and grime quickly, then rushed back to the hearth. Clothes were brushed, aired, and occasionally smoked over herbs to freshen them. Hair was combed daily but washed less frequently in winter, with oils used to keep the scalp from drying out. And despite these limitations, Vikings still cared deeply about personal grooming. Visitors from other cultures noted the contrast between their own less washed societies and the Vikings, who carried combs tied to their belts and bathed at least when it was safe. It was said that Viking traders were popular among Slavic and Eastern European women, not just for their goods, but for their appearance and smell. Yet even this had limits. Winter was not the time for vanity. It was the time for wool, for layers, for wrapping linen around the head, and for huddling close to others for warmth. A clean face was fine. A warm body was better. The sweat lodges, when used, were typically communal. Men and women might bathe separately or at different times, depending on the region. But the focus was less on privacy and more on survival. Stones were heated in the fire pit and transferred carefully with tongs into a small chamber. Water splashed onto them, hissed into clouds of steam, warming the air. Inside, people sat close together, letting their muscles loosen and their breath deepen. For a while, the cold was forgotten, but when it came time to leave, one moved fast. Towels, often just woolen cloths, were thrown over damp skin. Boots were pulled on before shirts. The fire might still crackle in the bathhouse, but outside, the world was teeth and wind. A wrong step, a moment of hesitation, these were the margins that separated, refreshed from feverish. Some stories even tell of people who never made it back. A young man who stepped into the cold after washing, tried to help his sister gather wood on the way, and collapsed from the chill. An older woman who bathed too long fell asleep afterward without drying properly and never woke up. These were cautionary tales told beside the fire, not to frighten, but to remind. So why risk bathing at all in winter? Because the alternative was also dangerous. Illness didn't just come from cold, it came from unclean wounds, from lice, from poor hygiene that could lead to skin infections, or worse. There was always a balance. The trick was knowing when to wash, and how much. It was often the elders, the grandmothers and old men who decided. They watched the weather, listened to the wind, felt the bones of the house creak with frost or soften with a thaw. If the conditions were right, if the sky stayed soft and the wind stilled, then washing was permitted. But it was done quietly, carefully, with everyone nearby in case something went wrong. One old practice involved bathing only a single limb at a time, a hand one day, a foot another. The core of the body was never exposed all at once. In this way, people stayed alive, not perfectly clean, but clean enough. And what of those who bathed in midwinter despite the warnings, the risk-takers, the vain, the hopeful? Were they brave, foolish, or simply unlucky? Among the countless daily challenges faced by the Vikings, few decisions carried such a strange tension as washing in winter. In a season where survival depended on conserving every scrap of warmth, the urge to cleanse oneself, to expose skin, pour water, and chase the sense of renewal felt oddly indulgent. And yet, people still did it, carefully, sparingly, and sometimes at great cost. You might imagine a Viking longhouse during one of those long winter nights, a circle of thick silence, broken only by the fire's crackle. In such a world, even the idea of warm water was a luxury. Yet, when it could be managed, when a bit of snow could be melted, a few embers coaxed into steam, a wash would be attempted. In most homes, it was not a full-body affair. People might focus on cleaning their face, armpits, feet, or scalp, the areas most prone to odor or infection. Warm cloths were soaked and wrung out, then used quickly and methodically. Women might take turns washing one another's backs while shielding the rest of the body with layers. Men often used woolen mitts dipped in water, rubbing vigorously and drying instantly after. Children were washed last. Their smaller bodies couldn't endure the cold as easily, so any warm water was saved until all was ready: the towels, the fire, the thickest cloaks for afterward. In many homes, a child's winter bath required the participation of the entire household, who gathered around with hot stones or breath-warmed cloths to help the little ones recover immediately. This ritual, equal parts caution and necessity, reflected the mindset of the Viking Age. Hygiene was important, yes, but never more important than survival. Those who lived furthest north, beyond the sheltered fjords and into the inland forests or open plains, often bathed less frequently. The cold there was sharper, more merciless. In these areas, bathing during the winter months could be unheard of altogether. One simply had to endure. However, in coastal settlements or more temperate areas of Denmark and southern Norway, the climate was slightly more forgiving. Here, bathhouses or sweat huts, known in Old Norse as svetas, were more common. These structures, usually made of timber and turf, were placed slightly apart from the main home, close enough for safety, far enough to prevent fire risk. Inside these sweat huts, a small fire would heat stones until they glowed. Water was poured over them to create thick clouds of steam. The hot air allowed people to sweat out impurities, relax sore muscles, and briefly escape the chill outside. But, as always, the clock was ticking. Every moment spent sweating meant more water on the skin, more exposure, and more danger the moment the door opened. There are some recorded practices, particularly in Iceland, where geothermal activity provided natural hot springs. These were among the few places where a true winter bath could be taken with some measure of safety. In the Icelandic sagas, there are mentions of characters visiting these warm pools, not just to cleanse themselves, but to gather gossip, or even heal wounds. Yet even here, caution was king. Hot springs were sometimes surrounded by treacherous terrain, their edges iced over or muddy. A single slip on a frost-covered rock could leave someone soaked and stranded, with wet clothes freezing to their body in minutes. It wasn't just the water that could kill, it was everything around it. Another little discussed aspect of bathing was the emotional effect. For some Vikings, especially those suffering from cabin fever after months indoors, the desire to bathe wasn't just physical. It was a longing for control, for dignity, for something normal in a world frozen stiff. A midwinter bath could feel like a declaration. I am still a person, not just an animal curled in furs. It was a statement against the gray crush of the season. But this pride came with risks. Many tales passed down through families told of individuals who defied the season's warnings. A young bride, hoping to impress her new husband's kin, scrubbed her hair with snow before the Yule feast and took to bed that night with a fever. An aging warrior insisted on washing before a village moot, only to collapse midway through the journey there, his body never warming again. In each case, the lesson was clear. Winter demanded humility. It did not forgive vanity. Cleanliness was honorable, but survival was sacred. Still, remedies existed for when things went wrong. Should someone bathe and begin to shiver uncontrollably afterward, a series of warming rituals would begin. First, they were stripped and placed in front of the hearth. Thick wool, soaked in warm broth, was wrapped around their limbs. Heated stones were tucked at the feet, the hands, even the chest, close, but not too close, lest they burn. Herbal teas made from yarrow, elderflower, and willow bark were pressed to the lips, drop by drop. And prayers, quiet, repetitive chants, were whispered by elder women, as though summoning the heat back into the body. In some regions, a practice called hot smoking was used. Not actual smoke, but the idea of wrapping the chilled person in thick hides or furs, and sitting them in the steam-filled sweat hut with no bathwater, only warmth and herbs. The hope was that the body, slowly coaxed back from the edge, would choose to return. And sometimes it did, but not always. The line between survival and sickness in winter was a thin one, often invisible until it was crossed. The stories tell of children who returned from bathing in spring-fed streams with flushed cheeks and warm laughter, and who never woke the next morning. Or of traders who spent months in snow-covered forests, never washing once, and lived. 280. There was no consistent rule, only luck, caution, and the wisdom of watching the wind. By late winter, around the time of Oreblot, a mid-season feast to honor Thor and drive back the cold, some families began to test the waters. Literally, they'd heat a little more water, wash just the face, let the children clean their hands and feet. These were small steps, a sign that the world was turning again, that survival had nearly been earned, but full-body bathing that still waited for spring. Did these careful rituals preserve life? Or did they remind people, year after year, that in the frozen north, even the simplest human act could become a test of will?